Salutations, ladies and doom. Welcome to podcast, the Storm Wars Social Awkward Outcast, Crazy Weirdos, and all of our nerds convene to talk and debate all things pop culture. With me, as always, is my co-host, the nerdy occultist, aka the Authenticator, Dalton L. Mortimer.
Good evening, everyone.
And I am your host, last time I'll wannabe, the Brainstorm of Pop Culture. How's everyone doing tonight?
I'm doing all right. The book that I ordered continues to be rather interesting. I was reading tonight about there was a section on the development of O's through Roman and into like Anglo-Saxon history. Something I learned that I either didn't know or knew and forgot previously is that when Romans came to the British Isles, not only would they offer offerings to their own gods for victory, they would try to essentially do an end run around the local gods themselves by offering to the local gods to convince them to try and to convince them to abandon their own people, which freaking treacherous bullshit. No wonder Rome fell shortly after colonizing the British Isles if that's how they operate.
Right. Hello, Giant Turtle. I'm doing well. Again, I have been actually rather busy as of late, so I haven't been able to read like Worm or anything.
And as far as my rereading of Pact goes, I just got done with the meeting part, the first council meeting part.
And that's fine. If you have to catch later, that's fine. Full honesty, it was kind of a slow week. I'm gonna be fully honest. Nothing really of note.
Yeah, I
caught my attention.
Yeah, I had to basically supply almost the entire episode's content because I managed to see a bunch of articles, but then I forgot where I saw them, and I had to dig for them to figure out where.
Yeah, well, to be fair, I was busy with work all week, so I kind of forgot to look up. I found a few things, but nothing like again. It was just a really slow week in terms of news for like pop culture.
As far as the Crow remake goes, we'll talk about it next week. I still have to watch it.
Yeah, I saw that last night. Unfortunately, yeah, everyone's going to have to wait until next week for the review, just because. But yeah, like
I have to find somewhere that I can pirate it from.
Yeah. I will say this: the trailers were edited very poorly to the point it made the movie look a lot worse. Because it was a lot better than the trailers made it look.
I hear semi good things about the opera house scene. That's
okay. If we're gonna do a brief talk about this, then we'll go more in depth next week. But cinematography wasn't bad. Like and actually the original score I found really good. Not like the songs they would play, right? Because I felt sometimes it was a bit either tone deaf or didn't really match the scene.
Mm.
But the original score was actually really good. I found somewhat very similar to the original Crow from 1993. Yeah,
Mhm.
1993, I think. Um, very similar like musical notes.
Hmm.
And Bill Skarsgård did the best. Like honestly, everyone in that movie did really well with what was given. And that's all I really want to say. So right now, until like next
Yeah,
week when Dylan has seen it, so we can discuss
yeah.
it more.
Next week. I have to find somewhere to pirate it from before we
But
can discuss it.
also, fun fact, somewhat fun fact, because yesterday was the opening day for the movie.
Hmm.
We went around 7:50. That's when it was supposed to play.
Hmm.
It was us and maybe like 6 or so people in that theater.
Yeah, I've been keeping a. I always every weekend keep an eye on the box office, and apparently, the general opinion is that it's probably going to open at the number 4 spot, which is sad. But
Yeah.
honestly, it doesn't sound like it either sounds like they didn't market the thing properly, or there just wasn't that much to recommend the movie in the first place.
It's
So
it's a complicated thing. Again, I do want to talk about this more, but we'll have to wait until next week for until Dawn sees it.
yeah,
That's not me trying to throw you under the bus. Obviously, I'm just
no, yeah. As soon as I find a place to pirate it from,
to be fair. It was just a random by chance thing that last night I went
mm,
because I either would have had to wait until Wednesday or so
mm,
to see it. And I thought, yeah, why not? Yeah, I worked a long day, and I just
mm,
wanted to chill. So anyway,
mm,
so this first again, all the articles Dalton sent. So
mm.
this first one is from RollingStone.com. Black Myth Wukong is a hit, but why is the game so controversial? As
See,
written by Diego Orgello and published August 23rd, 2024.
in short, it's controversial because it actually tries to please its audience, and the games journalist profession doesn't like that because they assume that that portion of the audience must be toxic, quote unquote.
Technical issues, a spotty development history, and a contentious fan base have marred the hype around the Chinese release.
Again, that contentious fan base bit means, we're not supposed to give the audience what they want. We're supposed to morally shame them into buying what we give them. And this group of developers actually tried to give the audience what they want. How dare they? Read.
Right. The expectations for Black Myth Wukong have been sky high since the first reveal back in 2020, which teased an action RPG with breathtaking graphics, set in a world based on the Chinese novel Journey to the West, with a Dark Souls style wrapping. After 6 years of development by independent studio Game Science, Black Myth Wukong was released on August 20th for PC and PS5, causing a stir in terms of sheer number of players amassed in just a few days. That's actually impressive.
Yeah, because wouldn't you go ahead and know it when you actually strive to give the audience what they want? They tend to be pleased with you. It's as if this extremely common sense principle has become some sort of weird arcane knowledge now.
I actually recently saw some videos of like the mythology guy. Good channel, by the way. I recommend like checking him out.
Mm,
Um, reacting to that game or playing it,
hmm.
and he's actually like, well, it's interesting because he has a lot of knowledge of that stuff,
Yeah.
and so it looks like an interesting game. I'm not like the again, I mostly don't play. I haven't really played video games in a while. Last
and and I'm limited to mobile games because, well, I have no computer or gaming system on which to play other things. So unless they come out with a mobile version, I'm probably never going to see this game. But I am pleased that it's a game that tried to deliver on what its audience wanted rather than what should be quote unquote morally permissible according to art school hackery.
okay, I always forget what IIRC means.
Yeah, I have those the yeah, the little abbreviations are completely confusing to me. They're not in my vernacular at all.
Hold on. There is some skepticism, if I recall correctly. Okay, all right.
Okay.
Thank you, Giant
Uh,
Turtle. Sorry about that.
yeah. I usually just overlook the abbreviations if I can feasibly avoid it because it gets annoying to have to ask every time what it means. I will
Right.
attempt to keep in mind that IRC means if I recall correctly. Although shouldn't that be IRCC? Because there are two words with a C in it. Never mind.
Well, recall is one word, so.
Okay, fair enough. Anyway,
If I recall correctly, there's some skepticism on if the SBI shakedown was real, though the SBI counterattack was, and that the CCP might be giving conditions for early access to the party line.
well, as far as I was aware, their only stipulation was while you're streaming, don't criticize China, which obviously it would be better off if we were dealing with a country where you were allowed to criticize them while playing their products. But by like modern day standards, I'm willing to accept that stipulation from China because at least their ethos makes a kind of sense and it doesn't actually impede the ability to criticize the product itself. Whereas, of course, in modern day games journalism, you're not allowed to criticize any socio-political or ideological underpinnings of the AAA nonsense because we are your moral superiors, don't you know? At least China is going, yeah, say whatever you want about the game, just don't dump on the CCP. Which, sadly enough, we live in a world where that is actually more libertarian and sensible than what the Western games journal media does. The moment when the CCP is the uncensorable, like the uncensored creator of products. Lol. Oh
All
god.
right. At the time of writing, moving on, or
Yeah, no, go ahead. Sorry,
okay.
it's just it hit me like a bullet out of the blue just now that we live in a world where Western art house, like art school media, is less censorious, or actually is more censorious than the CCP, and the CCP in turn is less censorious than the Western world. Oh God, we live in cloud world. Everything is upside down.
All right. At the time of writing, there are over 2.1 million concurrent players on Steam alone, as well as 132,000 viewers on Twitch watching dozens of streamers playing it. Black Myth Wukong is, based on numbers alone, a rampant success. Beyond the stats, critical reception paints a mixed picture of a game marred in technical issues on the PC version and multiple controversies surrounding both its development and the days around launch.
Well, see, here's the thing. If you actually ingratiate yourself to your audience, they're willing to tolerate glitches and technical issues, especially um on a double A rather than triple A type game, which Black Myth Wukong is. The issue is actually that modern day AAA Western games have as many, if not more, technical issues as the foreign AA market game like Black Myth Wukong. And in addition to all the technical issues and the day one glitches and the day one crashes, the developers, or at least the moral arbiters of the developers in Western companies, try to morally grandstand and shame their audience out of liking the things they like, and try to make a virtue out of pissing off the audience. Which, again, highlighting what I was just laughing about a second ago, it's somewhat telling and somewhat staggering that we live in a world where the freaking CCP is less moralistically authoritarian than the average modern day art school grad working for games journalist websites and or the development firms that those games journals tend to be on the same page with and tend to lionize. This is why it's so fucking staggering to most people, the way that being a fan or being a customer is not just shunned, but actively demonized by both the developers themselves and the games journals who are more or less on the same page as the developers. And that's why people prefer a literal product of the CCP over the average AAA nonsense like Suicide Squad or Forspoken.
Was you remember Hi-Fi Rush?
I know the name. I am having a hard time placing it.
It was a rhythm action game released, like, I think 2 years ago.
Vaguely, yes.
It came out around the same time as Forspoken and was considered the better of the two.
Right, yeah. Again, the AA industry and the foreign industry wouldn't be doing so well relative to the AAA industry if the AAA industry wasn't ideologically captured and moralistically authoritarian and going out of its way to spite the audience. Where fandom is not only considered to be a non-priority, but is actively considered to be morally suspect in most cases, if not outright immoral sometimes. Moving on, though.
Yeah. Excuse me. Here's everything you need to know about Black Myth Wukong, from how it parallels other hit games in its genre to why its reception has been so contentious.
It's not been contentious among the fans, it's been contentious among the art school hacks and the people who work with / for said art school hacks.
What is Black Myth Wukong? Black Myth Wukong is a single-player action RPG inspired by Chinese mythology. You play as the Destined One, following the footsteps of Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, and the main protagonist of the Journey to the West. Acting as a follow-up of sorts to the novel's events, the Destined One must retrieve the 6 relics of Wukong with the help of familiar characters from the original story. Based on the initial trailer, many expected the game to be a Souls-like in the vein of 2022's Elden Ring or 2023's Lies of P, or Pi. Lies of Pi, I think is what it's called.
Yeah.
But that's not exactly accurate. Like in those games, you face enemies with massive health bars, dramatic attacks, and complex patterns to memorize to take them down. There are bonfire-esque checkpoints scattered around the world for you to save your game, tend to your upgrades, and craft items. But it also lacks many of the key elements of traditional Souls-likes, okay? There's no penalty for dying or shared in-game currency or progressions that are lost if you hit a game over screen. Checkpoints are usually a few meters away from boss encounters too, so you're not forced to repeat long and tedious paths for a retry. Alright?
That sounds appealing to me. Then again, I'm somebody who struggles with hand-eye coordination and doesn't often play console games or computer games because I neither have console nor computer.
How's your hand-eye coordination and shit?
Yes, because disability is a son of a bitch.
You're not trying to get sympathy points, are you?
No, I'm just accurately describing things.
Fair enough. All right. Levels aren't exactly labyrinthine either. Another staple of developer From Software, whose Dark Souls series inspired the Souls-like genre. I thought it was. I thought. Well, no. Did From Software do Demon Souls too?
I don't remember.
I know Demon Souls came before Dark Souls.
I don't remember.
Okay, so moving on. While there's exploration and an array of items to reward your curiosity if you stray from the main path, the structure is quite linear. In fact, critics were surprised to see that Black Myth Wukong ended up being a boss rush of sorts, taking you from one tough enemy encounter to the next with short sections breaking the pace in between, featuring a few smaller enemies here and there.
And see, that kind of straightforward gameplay is something that appeals to the average gamer. It doesn't appeal to the average art school hack who alleges themselves to be a critic because they want unnecessary levels of complexity in every aspect of the game, except for things that relate to things like gameplay, world building, etc. So here again, we see the classic divide between the people to whom critics are speaking or should be speaking on the behalf of and the critics themselves. Critics in their ivory tower get a hard on over unnecessary socio-political and thematic bullshit, whereas the people on the ground care about things like likability, interestingness, gameplay, world building, etc. Which is why people in most areas that could require criticism are trusting quote unquote official critics less and less and less and favoring more and more and more people who are actually speaking on the behalf of gamers themselves, i.e., the people who actually operate by the same rules as the average gamer does, rather than unnecessarily forcing a critical theory textbook in the middle of everything.
Right. Okay. So Demon Souls, it came out in 2009, while the first Dark Souls came out in 2011, and they're both from Software.
Okay, so it is the same. It is the same company then. That makes sense. Okay, now moving forward.
The bulk of the experience centers around set pieces packed with spectacle and a dynamic combat system to plunge through them. I mean, to be fair, that's a lot of games. A lot of classic games.
Yeah, again, this is something that a gamer who prides themselves on being a gamer might appreciate. It just doesn't have the necessary socio-political and moral bells and whistles that critics can appreciate. Because critics are more interested in whether something is quote unquote fine art or modern art than whether it's actually enjoyable to engage with in any sense.
So this is interesting. Transformations and spirits are the main standouts, granting you signature moves of enemies or momentarily letting you shapeshift into previously defeated bosses. The latter can be anything from a slow-moving character that has a massive rock on its head to stomp the ground and charge forward with the force, to an anthropomorphic tiger wielding a great sword.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, that sounds really cool, actually.
Yeah, that's a neat game mechanic, and it does kind of make sense for the whole Journey to the West Sun Wukong ethos as well.
Yeah, because if I remember correctly, Sun Wukong could transform into anything, right?
Pretty much.
While Black Myth Wukong isn't an easy game by any means, you often have a large variety of tools at your disposal. A protagonist has plenty of surprises under his robe to mess with enemies, such as momentarily stunning them in place, creating decoys for foes to target while you may take a breather to heal yourself or charge a powerful attack, making them lose their balance and hit the ground Monster Hunter style, and more. Part of the charm is to collect as many of these transformations and spirits as possible and come up with creative ways to exploit weaknesses. Okay, that just sounds like a video game, to be honest.
Yeah, again, it sounds like an interesting game mechanic that the game is actually making proper use of, if anything.
It's Black. We're moving on.
Yeah.
Okay. It's Black Myth. Sorry. It's Black Myth Wukong good? On the surface, the popularity of Black Myth, Black Myth Wukong is hard to deny. Less than 24 hours after launch on August 20th, it's been 4 days, by the way, and this article came out yesterday. Less than 24 hours after launch on August 20th, it reached second spot on the most popular Steam games with over 2 million concurrent players. Sorry. Actually makes me curious what. Hold on. As such, it managed to surpass other popular single-player titles like Elden Ring and Cyberpunk 2027. Oh no, 2077. Sorry, as well as multiplayer behemoths like Dota 2 and Counter Strike 2. The only record left to break is the peak that PUBG Battlegrounds saw back in January 2018, with over 3.2 million players.
Again, this is the kind of reception you can have when you actually endeavor to give the audience what they want rather than morally grandstanding about how toxic and immoral the audience is. Almost like when you give people what they want, it results in them being happy or something. Moving on.
All right. As reported by PC Games In, the first day's player peak saw a significant drop off toward the evening. The dip, which took place around 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, left the game with just over 290,000 players, considering 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time is equal to 5 a.m. China Standard Time. It's likely that most players gradually went to sleep throughout the night. This is backed up by Daniel Ahmad, Director of Research and Insights at Nico Partners, who analyzed the video games market in Asia and MENA. In a blog post, Ahmad also shared details on how Wukong was the #1 most viewed game on Chinese game live streaming platforms on its first day, breaking previous records for single-player titles. Meanwhile, Singapore-based outlet The Straits Times reported that a number of Chinese companies are giving their employees time off to play the game, as well as reimbursing the cost of the game for those who bought it.
And there's nothing wrong with any of that. Many other companies in the West also do stuff like that. The difference is that Black Myth Wukong was buttressed by an actual organic on the ground excitement from people, whereas usually when Western companies do this, they get called out for being cringe and for trying to force the issue, because they do try to put their thumb on the scale, so to speak. Whereas when Black Myth Wukong does that, it only is a part of what makes the game successful. I.e., sure, they might have done something similar to that to get the ball rolling, but the difference between something like that and something like the Suicide Squad, for example, is when the ball got rolling on Sun Wukong, or Black Myth Wukong, it stayed rolling because there was an actual groundswell of support from organic fan bases. Whereas the Suicide Squad craters as soon as the company no longer puts their thumb on the scale. The difference being, one of these things was useful to get the ball rolling so that other people would pay attention to it, and then they stayed because they enjoyed it. And one of these is a sad, transparent attempt to try and force something to happen that isn't otherwise going to happen organically, which usually fails. That's the difference. Moving on.
Right. It may sound crazy for business to be making a video game release into a paid holiday. Businesses, sorry. It may sound crazy for businesses to be making a video game release into a paid holiday, but in context, it makes sense. The Chinese games industry has exploded in recent years with hits like 2020's free-to-play RPG Genshin Impact, but Wukong represents the country's first big AAA caliber foray into the global market. It helps that its source material, Journey to the West, is among the most beloved and recognizable pieces of Asian literature, inspiring everything from Dragon Ball to Jackie Chan adventures.
Yes. And moreover, making it a paid holiday for the people who made the game is also a way to reward them for putting in all the good work they did on it. You see how it's not necessarily purely a opportunistic manipulation when you think about it in human terms for like 5 seconds? Well, that's the difference between when Western games companies try to do the same thing and when Black Myth Wukong did it. When Black Myth Wukong did it, it felt like a celebration for a job well done. When Western companies do it, it's because they're trying their damnedest to force the issue because they know they haven't done a good enough job to create something worthwhile or please the audience, especially when they go out of their way to make the audience as unsatisfied as possible because they consider it their duty to morally grandstand over their audience for no explicable reason other than because art school brat. Moving on.
Sorry. In terms of critical reception, the current score on Metacritic for the PC version of Black Myth Wukong is sitting at 81, based on 69 reviews. Nice. Some outlets praised how some Wukong's abilities are adapted from the novel to the game's combat, as well as an unusual combo system that encourages fast-paced reactions. While the experience as a whole shows clear ambition with standout boss fights, level design lacks depth, and difficulty curve can sometimes feel uneven, and the story can be hard to follow without knowledge of the Journey of the West novel. Okay, that seems those seem like valid criticisms, I will say.
At least the last one. At least the you'd be confused if you didn't know about Journey to the West. But here is once again the thing, and this is why stuff like this does work for Black Myth Wukong, but doesn't work for games like Forspoken. If you are unfamiliar with Journey to the West, Black Myth Wukong can actually be interesting enough to get you interested in the original story. I can almost guarantee you that plenty of people who didn't even know that Journey to the West was a thing are now looking into Journey to the West because they had a good time playing the Black Myth Wukong game. Unlike Western offerings, which usually go out of their way to spite the lore they're basing things on, and will actively punish people who are more invested in the lore of certain IPs than people who are not. Do you see how one of these is the sign of a healthy addition to the market, and the other is a reason why so many Western companies are crashing and burning? A good game can convert people who are otherwise not invested in the source material. A bad game shits all over the source material and only services to make the people who know the source material well angry and are not enjoyable enough on their own merits to get new people into the IP. Because good things, i.e., things wherein a level of meritocracy was at play, have the capacity to convert the unconverted. Whereas things that actively shun meritocracy will actually do the exact opposite. They will deconvert the already converted because you will piss people off. One of these is a healthy state of affairs, the other is a sign of morally grandiose failure. Moving on.
All right. Others broke down in detail experiences with a number of technical issues. These range from several crashes on PC to instances of the player character falling through the game's world, forcing a restart during some boss fights. It's hard to keep a steady performance too, with some users struggling to run the game even with high-end PC graphics cards. I mean, to be fair, that just seems like normal issues that happen on.
That's the thing. They're drawing attention to this in the case of Black Myth Wukong, while ignoring the fact that it happens to almost every major AAA title, because they literally will release the game unfinished on launch. And Black Myth Wukong has the excuse of being a non-AAA title, and from it being from a foreign studio that is just now starting to approach the level of competency that the average AAA game typically has. And once again, the difference between something like Black Myth Wukong and something like the Suicide Squad video game was people are more willing to excuse things they are already having fun with or enjoying than things that actively shit on their intelligence and or investment in the IP. Do you see how one of these is very healthy and a very sane approach to the problem, and the other is literally making the problem worse on purpose? As a general rule, the happier you make your audience, the more lenient they will be in relation to mistakes. And the more you actively piss on the intelligence of your audience, the more they're going to hyperfixate on mistakes, because there's nothing of substance to placate their desire to not deal with this mistake. Do you see? Happy audiences will excuse issues and errors because they will be inclined to be more charitable. Unhappy audiences will hyperfixate on problems because that is all the game is to them, because it made no effort to actually ingratiate itself to them in any way. And in many cases, went out of its way to disingratiate itself to them in as many ways as you can care to name. Which is why, again, people hate on Suicide Squad and Forspoken, but people are willing to tolerate the growing pains of Song Wukong.
I had two ideas on how to redo Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League.
Mm-hmm.
Like two ideas. I think I mentioned to you like a long time ago when the game actually first came out.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, like sidebar here, obviously, but
yeah,
because idea-wise, I don't think it's bad. I think the pushing well, for one thing, I think it obviously shits on like the Arkham franchise overall.
Yeah.
And probably didn't help that Paul Dini didn't help write. Like he didn't work on Arkham Knight, to best of my knowledge, and
it probably also didn't help that it was one of Kevin Conroy's last voice roles as Batman, and the game went out of its way to disrespect the character.
Right. Fuck, I had something. Right, I was working on I had two ideas in my head of what to do with this. One was obviously going with the more traditional Justice League route.
Mm-hmm.
Although idea-wise, it would have been. I guess the premise was after Batman's supposed death or disappearance, whatever you want to call it, from
Mm-hmm.
Arkham, other heroes would be inspired because, you know, more or less Batman would have been like technically the first hero,
Mm-hmm.
and the Justice League was formed after that. This happens a few years later, and Brainiac comes and abducts like the major Justice League, including Wonder Woman.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it's up to like minor league members to fight the corrupted Justice League and free them. And I had this whole thing of like, because I was also thinking about like gameplay wise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of them that, because I was going with like the original lineup of Justice League, from Brave and the Bold comic. I think it was Brave and the Bold number 26.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously adding Superman, because funny enough, Superman and Batman were not part of the original Justice League lineup.
Mm-hmm.
But Martian Manhunter, because again, that guy needs to be given some fucking like credit and some.
Yeah, the just casual disrespect for Martian Manhunter is infuriating.
No, it's not. I wouldn't even say it's disrespect. It's
Indifference.
no. What's the word? It like means forgetting.
Apathy?
My point is like, yeah, Martian Manhunter is constantly shafted or forgotten entirely.
Well, it's kind of like the default assumption that Aquaman sucks that a lot of people have. Like, bitch, he's almost as strong as Superman physically, and almost as good of a telepath as the Martian Manhunter. Which, by the way, aside from anything else, that is another thing to pay attention to with regards to Martian Manhunter. He is one of the few people who can give Superman a run for his money, and has power.
Okay, hold on.
In addition to giving Superman a run for his money in terms of powers that they both have, John also has many powers that Clark does not have.
Like the guy can multiply himself. He can, well, not only shapeshift, obviously, he can expand his body mass. He can become a fucking giant. He has gone toe to toe with Darkseid in the comics to a fucking tie.
Yeah, not to mention the mind control, the telepathy, the telekinesis, all of the mental powers and so forth.
And not to mention he is, yeah, like I think in a comic Superman once said that Martian Manhunter is one of the people that he is afraid to ever actually get into a fight with.
Yeah. And moreover, especially after the recent bit of retconning that was done to Martian Manhunter, for anyone that doesn't know, for the longest time, Martians had a vulnerability to fire. According to the recent set of retcons, though, which normally I don't pay that much attention to retcons because they usually make the situation worse, but this retcon is actually, in my opinion, a good retcon, which is that Martians aren't actually particularly vulnerable to fire. It's just that a weakness to fire was psychologically bred into them so that they wouldn't be unstoppable.
Sorry, but back to the idea I'd had for this idea, because the other one involves Suicide Squad. But Martian Manhunter escapes, is weakened because Brainiac and his technology and stuff fucked him. But how the boss battles would go is that the Justice League members have to weaken them, and with the help of Martian Manhunter, go inside their minds and free the Justice League members' minds.
Mm-hmm.
And the members I had chosen, because it took me a while to come up with like the cast to replace the Suicide Squad. It was supposed to be Green Arrow, Black Canary, Hawk Girl, Jesse Quick. Fuck, I can't. I wrote it down somewhere, but I can't remember.
Mm.
And the other one was Suicide Squad Kill the Crime Syndicate, which honestly would have made more sense to me.
The Crime Syndicate are the evil alternate universe Justice League from Earth 3, if anyone doesn't already know.
Right, yeah. Because I mean, they had the multiverse set up in the original Suicide Squad game,
Mm.
and plus, you wouldn't mind killing these guys
because they're the Crime Syndicate.
Yeah, they're the bad guys. Even worse than the Suicide Squad, I'd say.
Hell, you could even have maybe some of the Justice League of Earth 3, i.e. the villains in the main timeline that are actually good in the Earth 3 timeline.
Yeah,
you could have them working with the Suicide Squad of our Earth.
Right, that and for the record, just this whole thing, don't do the jokester for Earth 3, do the Red Hood, because I remember Batman the Brave and the Bold did the heroic Red Hood, and God, that was the coolest fucking version of a heroic Joker I'd ever seen.
Mm. I mean, I'd be fine either way, but it would be. Imagine our universe's Harley Quinn reacting to the Joker as a heroic version of the Red Hood. Imagine it, and vice versa. Imagine, similarly, imagine, imagine, say, Supergirl reacting to a good version of Lex Luthor. And so, like, not only is this a cool concept for gameplay wise and world building wise and stuff, but it also allows for interesting character potential in the writing portion of the game. If you gave a shit about that kind of shit. Because you could actually, and this just popped into my head, but you could actually have the Red Hood of Earth 3 fall in love with Harley, and her having to cope with the idea of how loyal is she to Mr. J if this version of him loves her unironically and actually is willing to give her the relationship she wants from the Joker but cannot have.
Also, Arkham Harley, well, they changed the character, but from Arkham Knight, she was still obsessed with the Joker even after his death.
Mm. Which, so yes, assuming you wanted this to be in continuity with the Arkham games, which why wouldn't you? You could have her dealing with the fact that not only is this a good version of the man she loves, who loves her back, but if it's post the death of the Joker in the Arkham games.
I mean, the lady, sorry, I was just going to point out, in Arkham Knight, you know, the Joker doppelgangers that were infected with Joker's blood, she was enamored with them or trying to replace Mr. J.
Yeah, so if that's already a character dynamic that's been established, then you wind up with her having a good version of the man she loves who actually loves her back after his death, and who actually not only would be a decent replacement for the Joker, but would actually be better for her both psychologically and romantically.
And I do think, for one thing, you keep the cast of the Justice League the same. Obviously, they just be, you know, like Ultraman for Superman. Honestly, Jason Isaacs, who was playing Brainiac in Suicide Squad, could play Owlman. I could totally see him playing Owlman.
Yeah, he could work.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a whole tangent there, but it's not. It's just like when we brought up the Suicide Squad. Those ideas came back.
It's the annoying thing about modern day writers. It's not that the ideas they have are without potential or without merit. It's that they never utilize it, and or they go out of their way to spite whatever potential organically exists in the idea,
Well, it's
because
also
they view spiting the audience as a virtue in and of itself.
yeah. I was also thinking this, like the DLC characters they had, well, not DLC characters, but like the extra characters that came in, like the other, because there are other Earth versions of the villains being added to the Suicide Squad. They could have been Earth 3 heroes coming to Earth 1.
Yeah, and again, the story almost writes itself there, with Red Hood being the good version of the Joker, and actually having him actually fall in love with Harley while they work together.
Although I'm not sure what I would prefer, because Mark Hamill did state that without Kevin Conroy, he doesn't really feel like wanting to play the Joker anymore, because he was the Joker to Kevin Conroy's Batman.
Yeah.
So I don't think him playing a heroic version of, so obviously like the version of the Joker that was being implemented, a lot of people said looked really stupid and weird in the game. I think that actor could play him still, like this heroic version of Red Hood, obviously.
Or the one who voiced the Joker in the Injustice movie, I can't remember his name.
Or maybe Troy Baker. Maybe Troy Baker, because he voiced Arkham Origins Joker, and that was supposed to be like a younger version of Mark Hamill's Joker.
Right. Or the guy who played him in Batman the Brave and the Bold probably could also do it.
Oh yeah, that was a good actor actually. Yeah,
because I believe he already played the voice of Red Hood in the multiverse story that we're thinking of. I know the one you mean, because I really liked that episode too.
Cover for Batman, I think it was called, and also the next episode, which was a continuation of that one.
Right? Yeah, it was one of the few two-parters.
Yeah, which also introduced the Joker in the second part, but when they introduced the Red Hood first, which was really interesting.
Because you had Batman dealing with maybe there is still good in him, because if the other Joker, if the Red Hood can be the version of him that stayed on the straight and narrow, then maybe there's a way we can
again, I'm sorry,
humanize the Joker.
Sorry. Yeah. We'll get back to the article in a second, but the scene where it shows Red Hood's backstory after he's thrown into the vat of acid and looking in the mirror, and he starts to crack, start to do the Joker laugh, but suppresses that. Dude, that is so good.
It reminds me, speaking of Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill, the scene in, I forget what movie it was, but when Batman straight up admits that he doesn't want either of them to end up killing the other, and he actually is willing to rehabilitate.
That's Batman: The Killing Joke.
Yeah, it was in The Killing Joke, and that scene where Mark Hamill's Joker is like, "Thank you, but no." It's and then the scene with the joke about the escaped convicts using a flashlight to cross the building. God, that scene gets me every fucking time I see it.
It's too bad that the opening of that movie kind of marred everything else.
Yeah, the whole abuse of power of Bruce and Barbara thing. Just that whole.
I don't get it. I don't get Bruce
with them is. Well, it's honestly, I think it's because Bruce Timm wants to be edgy, because he's now in a state where no one will tell him no, because the 90s cartoons that he and Paul Dini created together were so successful, and so now he can go as edgy as apparently he always wanted to go. The problem is, and again, I'm extrapolating from what I've seen in interviews with them both, it seems like Paul Dini helped keep Bruce Timm balanced, and that's why when they worked together it was so much better than either of them apart. Yeah, but it seems like without Paul Dini to keep Bruce Timm's more edgy boy tendencies on a leash, He just goes as dark and as edgy as he possibly can for no good reason.
Right.
It's a little bit like how the original Star Wars trilogy was better because people were around George Lucas to help him and learn when to tell him no, whereas when he's left to his own devices, he becomes an overindulgent hack. And moreover, it's like Neil Gaiman in the modern day with regards to every time he revisits Sandman and it ends up making it worse. And yes, I know, I probably should get over it, but no, I'm never going to, because the loss of potential is to me more insulting and more frustrating than people who never had potential to begin with. The idea that you could, you know, if things were better, people actually could still be as good as they once were, but they've lost their minds and lost their touch and lost their sense of humility, and now everything is shit.
All right, shall we get back?
Yeah, moving on with the article.
Others broke down in detail experiences with a number of technical issues. These range from several crashes on PCs to instances of the player's character. I already read that. It's worth mentioning that footage of some of these issues wasn't present in a few reviews due to embargo restrictions, such as story-related spoilers, like some boss fights. IGN, for example, uploaded a second version with updated footage on launch day. Outlets didn't receive keys for the PS5 version either, which, as Digital Foundry reports, is also a bit of a mess with performance drops and visual woes. The latter is surprising, if not somewhat ironic. Sony's extensive promotion of Wukong as a PlayStation 5 game. The game will eventually be released on Xbox Series consoles, although tech issues are reportedly delaying that version. Okay, at least they're not trying to rush it out.
Yeah, I would much rather they take their time and get it right rather than strike while the iron is hot, so to speak. My brother actually does or did have a Xbox One and a PS5, so I might end up getting him that for Christmas, if for no other reason than maybe, I'm not sure if it has a two-player mode, but if it has a two-player mode, it would be cool if me and my brother could play that together. Because we haven't, my younger brother and I haven't hung out in a long time, and on my birthday, he actually wrote me a note inside the card he gave me for my birthday, and he was talking about how much he wishes we could spend more time together. So it fucking hit me in the feels. God damn it.
And you say you're a cold-hearted son of a bitch.
Well, yes, I very much am. But the thing is, you gotta know my brother. My brother doesn't. My youngest brother doesn't really show emotions all that well. So if he's saying something like that, you know he means it, and so it matters. It matters more. He's definitely of a more stoic temperament. So it was all the more impactful for its novelty because I wasn't expecting it from him.
Okay. What is this giant turtle? What is this edgy thing you guys are talking about with the Batman stuff? Okay, so Bruce Timm, to be fair, I would say it was mostly just the Killing Joke, because anything else I've seen hasn't really been super edgy from him.
I've seen a lot of people complaining about the same thing from Batman Caped Crusader.
Well, there's also Batman and Harley Quinn. That was weird.
Yeah, but okay. Point being, a couple of years ago, they finally did a cinematic adaptation of Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, and for some reason, Bruce Timm thought it was necessary for the first half to third of that movie to involve a Barbara Gordon Batgirl Batman sex scene.
Well, it was a Batgirl prologue, which I don't really think added anything to the story, mind you.
Yeah, no, it was completely and utterly necessary. The actual parts of the story that adapt to the Killing Joke are excellent as always, but I mean, to be fair, there's only so much you can do to fuck up the Killing Joke because the Killing Joke
Yeah.
is one of the
Okay. So there's
one of
also
the
the
better.
okay. Sorry. Yeah, he said. Drentro said what? Yeah. So even like with the original animated series stuff. Okay, I would say the scene itself was like maybe a minute, and it was
It was.
more like implied than really implicit. Um, but it was weird and unnecessary. It
And it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way,
but also
justifiably, because of course Bruce is Barbara's mentor. Not to mention the fact that that man regularly works with her father.
yeah.
So
Also, well, Bruce Timm for some reason has pushed Bruce and Barbara a lot in like the animated universe, DCAU.
I don't want to. I don't want to use the P word, but it definitely
Yeah, no,
it
it's
definitely
weird. It's weird, Dragon
it
Troll. I
it
mean,
it
there's
it it
twins
de-
involved.
it definitely has shades of the P word that I'm not going to say because I don't want to get blasted from YouTube.
Well, there's also no. To be fair, she was in like college when she first came back, girl in the DCAU.
Still, this is her. This is Batman at the very least breaching the mentor-mentee relationship and the
It's
trust of
fucked
her
up.
father.
It,
So
it, it's fucked up. I'm not going to deny that's fucked up. I'm just saying, uh, I wouldn't say it's PDF file as Giant Turtle says. Um,
yeah, but
it's weird. Yeah, it's weird. I
it skirts the line at least in a way that makes me very skeptical of Bruce Timm.
in DCAU lore, Dick Grayson and Barbara Gordon had a relationship.
That makes
So
more sense because they're co-workers and
they're the
in the
same
same. Yeah,
age range.
it's a much more horizontal relationship
But
between Barbara and Dick.
so that also add the layer of Bruce having an implied relationship with effectively his son's ex-girlfriend or girlfriend, however you want to say that.
Yeah, and the daughter of
His best
someone. Yeah, his best friend slash coworker.
yeah, like it's
I mean, arguably, Clark and Bruce have a closer relationship
I would say
than Commissioner
uh,
Gordon and Bruce
I,
do, but he's certainly up there in Batman's circle of trust, and Gordon definitely considers Batman to be up there in his circle of trust. So
yes, it's so weird, and I don't get what Bruce Timm was thinking with that. Like, I'm gonna be fairly honest. I think there is like a tie-in comic that has Barbara got pregnant with Bruce's kid. That was a thing that happened.
yeah, just which
Like,
again,
but
I it's hard not to read it as a statutory grape situation, if at the very least, if not straight up like pedo adjacent.
yeah, it's yeah. It out of all the things, because I think we can agree, Bruce Timm, like the DCAU, made a lot of definitive things for like DC as a whole.
Yeah,
But there were some mistakes made.
yeah. Apparently, Bruce Timm should never be allowed to have full creative control over things unless Paul Dini is there to keep him on a leash,
Or
because it's
someone
it
like that.
yeah it seems like the magic set of ingredients for the awesomeness that was the DC animated universe was Paul Dini and Bruce Timm sort of acting as checks and balances for each other, because neither of them I think Paul Dini more so than Bruce Timm, to be fair, but neither of them can really reach those same heights when they're left to their own devices. Again, like I say, if you put a gun to my head or put a gun to the heads of Paul Dini and Bruce Timm and asked me to um, save only one of them, it would probably be Paul Dini at this point, because some of Bruce Timm's unrestrained tendencies freak me right the fuck out, because there's already the like mimetic joke of, Batman is a groomer, or he grooms kids to, follow in his footsteps as crime fighters and this, that, and the other. That's all, the famous ambiguously gay duo trope and everything. That subtext is already a hell of a thing to try and get rid of. And then Bruce Timm comes along and inserts the Batgirl subplot in the beginning of The Killing Joke for no reason, because it wasn't in the original source material, and basically just makes it next to impossible to avoid the Bat groomer allegations. Just moving right the fuck along, because I don't want to look into this abyss anymore.
Okay. Other issues are related to audio, such as languages jumping from English to Chinese and vice versa at random, as well as some in-game journals seemingly lacking localization to English. Still, your experience may vary, especially on PC, where different personal setups lead to all sorts of results. Game Science seems aware of these problems, as indicated by a Steam blog post on launch day, warning that despite multiple internal tests, occasional serious issues may still arise due to the scale of different software and hardware environments across PC. At least they made,
Again, the fundamental difference here is, one, Black Myth Wukong is a double A game, all things considered, which means that a lower standard of quality is more excusable. And two, again, when you go out of your way to please your audience, they're more willing to be more charitable about mistakes. Whereas the average AAA game has all of those same technical problems that Black Myth Wukong does, and in addition to that, goes out of its way to spite its own fan base. Do you see how in one case the problems are excusable, and in the other case they're just a symptom of a larger problem? Because in one case, the people in question are trying to give their audience what they want in good faith, and in the other, they completely fail to on purpose because they actively want to spite their audience. Therefore, the mistakes of a AAA game, not only for professionalism reasons, but also because if you don't give me anything positive to counterbalance the negative aspects, I'm going to be less charitable to you than if you give me something positive to make the negative aspects more accusable. It's this thing about building trust with your audience. In one case, the developers seem to have done the effort to build that trust with their audience, and in the other case, they go out of their way to shit on the trust of their audience as much as possible and as frequently as possible.
Okay. Excuse me. Moving on?
Yeah.
Why is it controversial? Despite the hype surrounding Black Myth Wukong over the years, it hasn't been without significant controversy. The most notable was a report by IGN, which compiled alleged sexist comments made by the studio's founders and other internal team members, providing a deep look into misogynistic remarks that plagued the game's development and a toxic work culture. During an interview in late July with PC Gamer, the outlet asked a Game Science representative if they could address the details in the report, to which they replied, "We have no comment, we're sorry. We're only looking to answer questions related to the game and the gameplay."
God forbid people who make a product should be more focused on giving a meritocratic product than in moral fucking purity. And by the way, as long as we're talking about toxic work environments, do you not think that the moral authoritarianism of modern day social justice would ever create a toxic work environment? given that one of the fundamental axioms of social justice is meritocracy is a harmful delusion that we have to deprogram people of, do you not think that that sort of work culture has driven otherwise meritocratic game developers into silence or into privately snitching on said companies? Because I can guarantee you, based on how many workers at said companies end up reporting things to sympathetic commentators on the internet, that the social justice approved moral hierarchy itself creates a quote unquote toxic work environment. And if anything, it seems that the Black Myth Wukong company may have had a more open and irreverent approach to things like jokes or to quote unquote misogynistic comments, which leads to a much healthier creative environment and creates a focus on delivering on the meritocracy of the product. Because for all of the CCP's communist meddling, they seem to have been willing to acquiesce to the idea of meritocracy, at least when it came to producing a good product. Whether they were being truthful to their principles in that regard or not is an open question. And once and for all, fuck the CCP, because I want to see a world or a future where the government of what is now Taiwan takes back the government of China and reinstates the imperial era. But at the very least, again, the irony is that the CCP was less moralistically authoritarian and censorious than Western companies inculcated with a bunch of social justice and critical theory woo woo. And will it ever occur to any of you to be self aware about that? To realize in the privacy of your own thoughts that your morality has gotten so out of hand that the CCP's approach to product making is actually preferable to your bullshit? You are officially worse than the CCP as far as most of your audience is concerned. Does that not shock or frustrate you at all? Moving on.
All right. Giant Troll, have you guys seen some of the charts coming out of corporate America on what you're supposed to do when half of it is stuff that will fuck you over in the real world corporate environment? I don't really pay attention to that stuff, to be fair.
Yes, I have seen at least a few of those. Granted, the last set of said charts that I saw were related to the ESG initiatives. I don't know how the modern day bridge initiatives are different. I don't suspect they are very different. I expect it's just a loose rebranding, but I have seen such charts, and yes, again, it's funny how these people claim to be the arbiters of what is and isn't a toxic work environment when, for all they know, their moral grandstanding is itself an impetus for a toxic work environment that actively goes out of its way to demonize meritocracy at every turn. Moving right along, though.
All right. IGN received a similar response after a demo session at this year's Summer Game Fest, despite Game Science telling the outlet it'd have a statement related to reports of sexism during the appointment, leading to launch an email sent from Black Myth Wukong marketing team, which was shared by a few content creators on social media and later verified by news outlets, indicated a list of topics to avoid alongside the key to the game. The list includes standout items such as feminist propaganda, COVID-19, and content related to China's industry policies, opinions, news, etc.
Yes,
Some of which are related to IGN's report. Okay.
Because they don't want to inculcate their company or their culture or their country with all of this social justice nonsense. The only real noteworthy standout there was, hey, don't shit on the CCP while you're reviewing it. Which again, compared to the hoops you must jump through to get Western game developer and games journalist approval, you do realize that that is a far more understandable prescription. Obviously, I would prefer a system of free speech and, classically liberal values, wherein you could say whatever you want. But given that the trials and tribulations of the CCP aren't even relevant to things like the directness of the gameplay, or whether the character writing is good, or whether the game is fun and enjoyable and engaging, I'm willing to overlook the CCP's CCP-ness because, again, it's less moralistic and censorious than Western DEI and ESG vectors are. At some point, it might become incumbent upon the West to understand the notion of, wait a minute, our moralistic sensibilities are less are less preferable than the CCP's. Are we the baddies? But that would require a level of self-awareness that most social justice warriors do not have, and thus the problem gets continuously worse. And then things that are not Western, like companies headquartered in Japan, South Korea, and now China, become more and more good as the West continues to shit the bed over and over and over again, with completely no awareness as to the fact that they are the baddies.
Moving on, or General. This was less SJW and more just wage slavery. Also, Bridge isn't the replacement; it's the overarching program that makes DEI and other things not the final boss, but the next rank up. It is just in more sane ways. Oh, please don't join V in the. Is China really that bad compared to the West Club?
I'm not. Again, my stance is fuck the CCP. The proper government of China is in Taiwan. But I want to make this point for the sake of rhetoric to people like the guy who wrote this article, because it might maybe finally sink into their heads that they are the baddies. If you can, in all seriousness, make the claim, the interference of the CCP was less toxic to the overall quality of the game and the product than the meddling of ESG, DEI, and Bridge. It might sink in if you point out to them just how starkly they have fallen, that now people are, at least tentatively, looking at the meddling of the CCP as less overbearing than ESG, DEI, and Bridge. And it might also point out to said moralistic fucktards just how much in clown world we are currently living. Anyway, moving along.
Right. Okay. The email was intended for content creators who plan to cover the game on launch, but didn't include a non-disclosure agreement. Members of the press and reviewers who were sent a key before launch did not receive that list. As reported by the Aftermath, the anti-feminist propaganda streaming restrictions are unusual, but not entirely unprecedented for the usual guidelines. Sponsorship activation deals between brands and content creators. In the case of Wukong, since the email didn't involve a sponsorship contract or NDA, there was no way to legally enforce the list items. This led to some streamers mocking the situation, like Moon, who ran a nearly 8-hour-long live stream on launch day with 324,124 views, named the stream COVID Isolation Taiwan is a Real Country Feminist Propaganda. The VOD of the stream features the phrases human rights and high-speed rail.
Again, I am fully in support of Taiwan as definitely a real country. And again, on almost all political metrics, fuck the CCP. the CCP has ruined the great nation of China. But that being said, I would still rather deal with the restrictions of the CCP, at least in this case, than the restrictions of ESG, DEI, Bridge, and the average HR and PR department in the West. And the fact that the thing that offended most of the aforementioned HR and PR department people was the hey, don't bring feminism into it, that goes to show you just how in hoc to feminism said people are. As Voltaire once said, if you want to find out who rules over you, find out who you cannot criticize. And apparently, on that list is definitely feminism. Granted, this should be no surprise to anyone who's been paying attention for the last 10 years or so, because intersectional feminism was the patient zero for this bullshit. Moving on.
Right. Much of the community's response to critical reviews has also been in bad faith. Screen Rant, which scored the game with 3 out of 5 stars, included lacking in inclusivity and diversity as one of the cons of the review summary, but required an editor's note on the footer explaining that the author's name has been removed for their safety due to the backlash from fans. Users also shared a fake IGN review en masse, which the actual reviewer quickly discredited. At the time of writing, the 5th most helpful review on Wukong's Steam store page has homophobic remarks about diversity and has been up since launch day. There are currently over 277,000 reviews on the platform, which aggregate to an overwhelmingly positive rating.
Okay. IGN, my sweet morons. You need to learn the lesson that Jack Thompson learned about 20 or 30 years ago, which is, as much as it might perturb you, people don't care about the moral credentials of forms of art and entertainment. And the more you centralize moral credentials over meritocratic ones, or use them in place of meritocratic ones, the more insufferable you look. You know how everyone used to mock people like Jack Thompson for the "won't somebody please think of the children" maneuver? Well, you are doing the same thing, except your version is "won't somebody please think of intersectional feminism" or DEI or ESG. In fact, ESG, DEI, and Bridge are basically the social justice left's equivalent of the right wing's Hays Code or the Comics Code Authority back in the day. I.e., the average gamer is characterized by irreverence in the face of moral authority, and they always have been. The only difference is people like Jack Thompson and Frederick Wertham came at that moral censorship from a right-wing perspective, and ESG and DEI comes at it from a left-wing perspective. And by the way, you can be left-wing and not like social justice. Once again, I want to make this very clear. The issue is not right versus left. It is libertarian versus authoritarian. I don't care whose moral sensibilities are claiming sacrosanct status over art and entertainment. Whether it's the Jack Thompsons, Frederick Werthams, and Hays Code of the world, or whether it's the ESG, DEI, and Bridges of the world. I care that anyone's moral sensibilities are being placed over the issue of quality and meritocracy. And frankly, if your morality is anathema to meritocracy, your morality can and should get fucked. I don't care if someone is right or left of me. I care whether they are more or less libertarian than I am, because as I've often said, and will indeed continue to say, the important political distinction is not a left versus right issue, it is a libertarianism versus authoritarianism issue. And moral censors, like the Frederick Werthams, Jack Thompsons, and J. Thomas Bowdlers of the world, or the Anita Sarkeesian, Zoe Quinns, and Brianna Woos of the world, are all authoritarian, regardless of whether or not they are right or left. Because you want to prioritize morality over meritocracy. And anyone who prioritizes morality over meritocracy is frankly my enemy. That is a hard line that I have. Your morality is not the center of the goddamn universe, and if you try to substitute moral purity with quality or meritocracy, I will go full Fred Revolution on your ass, as and when I need to. Moving on.
All right. All right. Black Myth Wukong has gotten a majority of mixed to positive reviews after years of hype, but is being hoisted on its own petard by controversy. It's possible that Game Science might iron out the technical issues present in the game in coming weeks or months, polishing the experience. Beyond that, it seems plausible that Wukong's legacy could remain tarnished by an unwillingness to address past comments while continuing to foster a contentious fan base prone to respond to any sort of criticism in bad faith.
Here's the thing, my dear writer of this article. Your controversy only matters as and when people consider your opinions to be authoritative. The reason why the controversy is not only not hurting Black Myth Wukong, but is actually in many ways helping it, is because it is controversial on the metrics of, and only on the metrics of, the critical elite, the professional journalist, and so on. And the thing is, the people who like games like Black Myth Wukong, Helldivers, Stellar Blade, Hogwarts Legacy, etc., they actually consider pissing you off to be a merit. And so the more controversial you and your ilk find it, the more pleased a certain percentage of the fan base will be, because again, as a general rule, gamers don't like morally censorious authoritarians, whether they be right, like Frederick Wertham, J. Thomas Bowdler, or Jack Thompson, or whether they be left, like the arbiters of ESG, DEI, and Bridge. It doesn't matter whether your preferred form of moral censorship is the Hays Code, the Comics Code Authority, or the or the ESG and DEI strictures. If you're prioritizing some moral virtue over qualitative and meritocratic ones, then you will get fucked. And people will actually enjoy being irreverent to your standards, i.e., the more controversial you can find it, while being simultaneously completely impotent to do anything about it, the more a certain percentage of the fan base will actually be pleased. Because not only do people dislike moral authoritarianism, they, by the same token, very often enjoy flouting moral authoritarianism deliberately and as irreverently as possible. When you are the moral fuddy-duddies, people will get a bit of joy out of pissing you off, especially when you being pissed off also is a mechanism to demonstrate just how impotent and irrelevant your moral strictures actually are in the realms of quality or success. Moving along.
All right. All right. Next article then.
Yep.
So this is originally from news.northeastern.edu. Northeastern Global News. Disney canceling Star Wars The Acolyte sets a dangerous precedent and is bad news for the future of Star Wars and Hollywood, expert says.
Again, the only precedent that seems to be putting your moral knickers in a twist is when we give the audience what they want, they disregard our moral structures. Because your moral structures are, of course, not only irrelevant, but actively counterproductive in most cases. Moving on.
Excuse me. So it's written by Cody Mello Klein, published August 22nd, 2024. The subheader is Disney's decision to cancel The Acolyte for one season reinforced toxicity in its own fan base and will limit the stories that will be told in the galaxy far, far away, a Northeastern fandom expert says. Wow, fandom expert. That sounds credible.
That toxicity you mention is this thing where people prioritize the in-universe logic and enjoyment of the IP over moral and socio-political gobbledygook. Because again, you and your ilk, your art school educated ilk, might only see art as a means to an end, but quite a lot of people see art and entertainment and world building and storytelling as an end in itself, and therefore feel more loyal to the IP than to any ivory tower inquisition on the subject. Moving on.
Tears were shed in a galaxy far, far away this week as Disney announced it was canceling its newest Star Wars show, The Acolyte, after just one season.
Quite a lot of them were tears of joy, I imagine, because here's the thing. I am an easy sell for magic in Star Wars. My favorite non-movie character in all of Star Wars is Mother Talzin. And yet even I couldn't begin to defend the unnecessarily stupid and convoluted bullshit of the thread cult of whatever the fuck planet it was named. Not even I could put a positive spin on the power of one, the power of two, the power of many, and thus even I was grateful when the Acolyte got the axe, because entirely regardless of whatever moral dog you might have in this particular race, the end result of all that moral meddling was an utterly shit project that actually made the IP of Star Wars worse for having existed within it. Now, you could have easily written the thread cult in a way that wasn't completely and utterly insufferable nonsense, and I would have probably defended you, even if other people still were shitting on it. But as it happens, you were so preoccupied with making a morally exceptional product that you completely considered as irrelevant whether the thing was actually good or not. And in fact, considering that one of the axioms of social justice, by definition, is meritocracy is harmful and a delusion that we need to deprogram the audience of, you actively went out of your way to make the story less good by any sort of intersubjective or objective standard, and as a result, the audience very obviously turned on you, because people generally care more about the quality of whatever IP they're engaging with than they do of its quote-unquote moral worth, or socio-political worth, or thematic worth, depending on how you want to put it. Moving on.
But not everyone was sad about the news. A small but vocal portion of the Star Wars fan base celebrated the end of a Star Wars show that critics and other fans felt was a breath of fresh air for a franchise that was growing long in the tooth. Oh, shut the...
You only feel that way because you prioritize things like the moral and socio-political themes of a show or the authorial intent of a show over and above its internal consistency, its world building, its characterization, or indeed anything that could be meaningfully referred to as meritocracy in storytelling. And that is why people enjoy pissing you off. Because when you see art as a means to an end rather than an end in itself, you will piss off people who do consider art to be an end in itself, or do consider the merits and qualities of a piece of art to be contained primarily within the art and not in non-diegetic external bullshit. Moving on.
For anyone familiar with modern fandom, the internet, and Star Wars specifically, it should come as no surprise. Star Wars fans have review bombed movies and shows that center women and people of color in their favorite franchise. They have harassed actors until they leave social media. Oh my god.
No, they don't, and they never have. Leia, Padme, Mother Talzin, Jocasta Nu, so like there are Ahsoka Tano, Asajj Ventress. The list goes on ad nauseum. The issue is you can't tell the difference between the political ideology of intersectional feminism or critical queer theory or post-Frankfurt School neo-Hegelianism and the identities that those ideologies claim to speak to or pander to, but in actuality just use those identities as human or ideological shields for the overt subversion or fighting of meritocratic standards. Because again, one of the key features of intersectional feminism vis-a-vis critical theory and so on is the idea that meritocracy is a harmful social construct and that people shouldn't be allowed to believe in it unironically or sincerely. And in fact, that sincerity itself, with regards to artistic intellectual properties, is in and of itself a delusion that we must deprogram people of. And when you make as a central axiom to your piece of art that art is only valuable as a means to an end rather than an end in itself, and that meritocracy or sincerity in caring about the events in your art is a childish delusion that only morons would make, then it's no surprise that the end result of that mentality is a show that goes out of its way to be as low quality or anti-quality as possible. And when a thing is created with an attempt to use a pre-existing IP that instead shits all over that pre-existing IP, it will naturally upset anyone who does have any sort of sentimental, emotional, or rational attachment to that IP. Moving on.
Alright, what is new is that Hollywood might be listening to him, says Steve Granelli, an associate teaching professor of communication studies at Northeastern University who specializes in fan culture dynamics. There's a section of the fan base that is limiting the types of stories that are told and the types of characters that the wider fan base is going to have access to. I don't think that bodes well for the Star Wars franchise moving forward, Granelli says.
It actually does, because the more the stewards and guardians of an IP make an effort to ingratiate themselves to the fan base of said IP, the more likely the end resultant piece of art will be meritocratic in its own right, at least on some vector. The issue is that for the last 10 years and change, the people who are stewards of various IP have gone out of their way to spite their organically occurrent fan bases and instead listen to a bunch of neo-Hegelian art school hacks. People who believe in things like intersectionality, critical queer theory, race theory, etc. People who borrow most of their intellectual heft from the mentalities of the Frankfurt School, who actively shun the idea of objectivity or intersubjectivity in regards to quality, and who in fact believe that meritocracy is a consensus-based delusion that only those who are undereducated believe in unironically. And as a result, any IP that was founded on a world, characters, or a component of storytelling that people can appreciate for its own sake has gotten more and more and more corrupted by the aforementioned neo-Hegelian gobbledygook. And the more an IP is founded on in-universe logic or in-universe characterization or in-universe world building over thematic or authorial intent, the more the focus on those things to the exclusion of the other will inevitably ruin anything it touches. Especially when ruining everything it touches is one of the explicit vectors of social justice, because they believe that meritocracy is a consensus-based illusion and has no meaningful value. And in fact, go out of their way to spite any preconceptions of meritocracy that they find originally occurring in those fan bases, which inevitably makes the fan base first angry and then dismissive of the opinions of the aforementioned art school hacks. Moving on.
Alright. Toxic fandom, which exists in almost every major fan base from Taylor Swift to Marvel, is what happens when, for example, a fan's love of Star Wars becomes less about their connection to the story of Luke Skywalker and more about how integral Star Wars is to their identity, says Joseph Riegel, an associate professor of communication studies at Northeastern who studies online community and culture.
Okay, Joseph. I'm not going to use your title. I'm sure you are called Professor Friedel or Dr. Friedel by your two-dimensional students, but I believe in the principle that your title doesn't matter if it is founded on meaninglessness. And so, Mr. Friedel, I revoke your doctoral or professorial credentials because they are apparently meaningless. Mr. Friedel, you just separated two things which are inexorably related. If you find that you identify with a world, a universe, a character, or an IP that will inevitably become part of your identity, because the more you are moved by a piece of storytelling or art, the more central to your sense of self and perspective that art will be, especially if it is something that occurs during your formative years, which things like Star Wars, Marvel, and yes, maybe even Taylor Swift, although let's be honest, most of the Taylor Swift fan base are extremely basic white girls and or extremely effeminate gay men. And usually those people don't get classed as toxic fandom unless they demonstrate an ideological dissonance between their sense of self and academia's preconception of their sense of self. Then they get called internalized self-hatred, etc., and so on. But anyway, you just conflated, you separated two things which ought to have been conflated, i.e., the more invested in the story of Luke Skywalker someone is, or in the broader universe of Star Wars someone is, the more central it will be to their identity, especially when it occurs in their formative years, which most of these IPs, by virtue of being for all ages, tend to have a lasting effect on people during their formative years, especially. Moving on.
Okay. That's where fandom tips from passion into a sense of ownership and results in fans defining who can and can't be a fan. Riegel says the internet has only amplified the kind of gatekeeping that exists in some fan communities. There's a sense that... Hold on. There's a sense that these cultural properties are mine. It's a big part of my identity, and I'm going to control who's good enough and the access. Regal says it has become very, very possessive. Oh, fuck off.
Again, you are disconflating. In fact, you are unnecessarily deconstructing something which makes perfect fucking sense. The more central to someone's identity something is, the more passionate and informed they are on the subject matter related to it, the more likely they are going to have meritocratic hurdles for new initiatives to get involved in the IP. And that's generally speaking a good thing because it results in more people who are more invested and less superficial about their allegiance to the IP. This is the issue. The reason why that gatekeeping mechanism exists and should exist is because it is an attempt to engage in this thing we call meritocracy, i.e., the more respect you have in a fandom space, generally speaking, the more knowledge or passion you have for that IP, and therefore the more your opinion matters. Do you understand why someone who is passionate and informed on a topic is generally considered more authoritative on that topic than people who are superficial or don't exhibit anything like as much passion? Do you, do you understand why people who have an encyclopedic knowledge of something would be more respected by the average person than people who have only the most superficial knowledge or affiliation towards a thing? Because again, I know I know I pissed all over your credentials earlier, and I will continue to do so because they appear to not be worth the paper they are printed on. But you would think that someone who puts so much stock in academic officialdom would understand the notion that you put more faith, more stock, more authority in people who can demonstrate a more thorough knowledge of a topic or a more invested formation on a topic. Because as I recall, the hoary halls of academia very, very much distrust anything that they would define as mis or disinformation. And yet they can't extend that line of thinking to places like fandom spaces. They can't understand why someone who is more knowledgeable and more passionate and more invested in an IP is regarded as having a stronger fandom and a more respectable fandom of that IP than someone whose approach is superficial. To put it in academic terms, in the same way that you as an academic trust people with doctorates more than you trust people with bachelor's or associate's degrees, fans or would-be fans trust people with larger degrees of expertise, passion, and investment than they do people who have a very superficial or basic understanding of the subject matter. That same authoritative information that you worship like it's the cure for every conceivable ailment also organically arises in fandom spaces. And as a result, there are levels and hurdles of investment that you must get through before you can be considered a real fan. Just like there are levels and hurdles you must go through in academia in order to be considered a quote unquote real expert. Now, mind you, much as I would poo poo your credentials because they're not worth the paper they're printed on, it is entirely possible for someone to fake credentials in order to gain more respect than they otherwise should have. And that is why the mechanism of gatekeeping exists in both cases. However, in the one case, this gatekeeping is based on bureaucratic officialdom, which is counterproductive, and in the other case is based on levels of investment, meritocracy, and or passion, which is more productive. And in actuality, that makes fandom in many ways more meritocratic than modern day academia. But if you ever acknowledged that little canard, your head would probably explode because you would realize just how worthless your life has been up until this point. But let's not dwell on it. Moving on.
Right. Okay. Da, 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 da. As Star Wars, Marvel, and other pieces of geekdom, as Regal calls it, have entered mainstream culture, it creates even more contentious spaces for gatekeeping. Amplified in online communities that serve as echo chambers, those ideas get even more ingrained. For some fans, the need to maintain ownership over something that they feel is slipping out of their grasp can then boil over into outright racism and misogyny. Regal says, "Oh, fuck off."
Again, because just as you and your ilk try to maintain quote unquote authoritative sources on various different subject matters, people who have the requisite expertise, passion, and investment in an IP are very critical when that IP becomes less meritorious as a result of a bunch of surface level meddling from extraneous interlopers. In the same way that you in academia are very skeptical of people who feign credentials they have not earned, so too fandom spaces are extremely skeptical of choices made by the stewards of IPs that don't accord with any expertise, understanding, or investment in those IPs. I.e., when the people who own an IP are not experts on that IP, the people who are experts on that IP will call out as and when the stewards of the IP are not only changing things which ought to be left alone, but also are in so doing making the IP less meritorious and or less credible to the average person. Just as you would if, for example, flat earth ideology was woven somehow into academia, they are annoyed when the stewards of the IP are not operating as authoritative experts of that IP. And again, I'm translating this into academic jargon speak in the hope that you will notice the contradiction in your mode of thought. Because apparently, being gatekeeping towards mis or disinformation is something you hold sacrosanct, but you don't understand the need for it in fandom spaces. Which either means that you haven't thought through the issue, or you are arbitrarily engaging in special pleading with regards to your particular area of interest and not allowing anyone else to have any sort of possessiveness, ownership, or desire to maintain quality in their particular area of interest. Moving on.
Right. In the case of The Acolyte, certain toxic fans review bombed the show, claiming it deviated too far from their sense of what Star Wars is. Unlike previous Star Wars movies and TV shows, The Acolyte has had very little connection to pre-existing characters, taking place during an era long before the events of the films. It also prominently features women and characters of color. Okay, hold on, Dawn, before you do, because I know you have something, right?
Go.
Can I mention that people love like Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic and Star Wars The Old Republic games, which have a lot of varying like female and characters of color. Hell, the main character Revan of Knights of the Old Republic uh, can be either male or woman depending on who's playing them, because you know character creation, right? Though I think in actual Star Wars canon, Revan's revealed to be a male.
Yeah, but even so, you've got
hold on. Sorry, just like, and that story is set thousands of like 1,000 years or 3,000.
1,000, I think.
Right, 1,000 years
Because
prior.
it's after Rule of Two, I'm pretty sure, that Knights of the Old Republic take place. It's after the establishment of the Rule of Two.
Right. But yeah, it's 1,000 years before the prequels, original trilogy, anything, and people love that. Also Darth Bane, which happened maybe.
Well, yeah, but not to mention Kreia, who
Right.
is a favorite standout, a fan favorite character in those games. The Gray Jedi, who frequently offers players quest lines.
Right. But also my point. But my point. Also, and again, um, yeah, again, like Star Wars has a lot of great characters and a lot of. I'll be honest, there are a lot more great female characters than there are male characters. I think. I could be
It,
wrong. I think I
it's
feel like it is
it's
a more balanced.
it's at least arguable. But
It's arguable.
the point I was going to make is you appear to not be able to tell the difference between female characters and ideologically feminist characters. They aren't the same thing, which explains why people love characters like Leia, Ahsoka Tano, Padme Amidala, Asajj Ventress, Mother Talzin, Jocasta Nu, Yaddle, the list goes on and on ad nauseum. But they dislike characters like Osha and May from the Acolyte, or the all-female cult of thread users. And again, you can even more closely go like for like with the thread cult, because there's already a pre-existing cult of witches that is very well liked and very well loved in Star Wars canon, called the Night Sisters. Now, mind you, Ahsoka, the show, not the character, but Ahsoka, the show, went out of its way to make the Night Sisters lamer than they ever have been depicted before. And so some of the positive feeling people have towards the Night Sisters has gone down. But at least prior to the meddling retconning of Ahsoka, the Night Sisters was an extremely well liked faction among Star Wars fans. The reason people liked the Night Sisters, at least as they were portrayed in the Clone Wars and in Rebels, but dislike the thread cult of Bach 2, I think, or Octu, whichever the fuck. Um, the reason people like the Night Sisters but dislike the thread cult is because the Night Sisters operated by the in-universe logic of the Star Wars canon and were meritorious, i.e., they were likable and interesting characters and added something interesting to the world building of the Star Wars galaxy. The Thread Cult, on the other hand, were ideologically feminist author self-insert characters, and their mechanics were not explained, not explicated in any way whatsoever, and were actively derivative or ambiguous with regards to how they functioned. Contrast this with how the magical ichor of Dathomir amplifies the magics of the Night Sisters. Perfectly well explained within the parts of the canon where the Night Sisters appear, with the possible exception of Ahsoka, because Ahsoka really did a number on the Night Sisters. But in every other instance of the Night Sisters being relevant to anything, the magical ichor, which is native to Dathomir, and its interactions with the Night Sisters' magic, was not only well explained and well thought out, but is one of the favorite aspects of the Night Sisters. Contrast this with how the Thread cult uses the thread, and how it was never fully explained or differentiated from how any other species uses the Force, and you understand why it is very important to differentiate between female characters who operate by in-universe logic, canon, reasoning, etc., and so on, and are focused on making likable and interesting and engaging characters, and feminist characters who are more so supposed to be mouthpieces for the author's will and never pay any attention to in-universe logic, let alone any sort of meritocracy of character. I.e., if you make shit characters for ideological reasons, that's not going to prevent them from being obviously shit characters any more than writing good characters based on the in-universe logic of the universe will cause hatred because they are meritocratic. I.e., hardly anyone ever complained about the Night Sisters until Ahsoka ruined them, because the Night Sisters were cool. They added something to the mythos, and they made sense in the logic of Star Wars, whereas the thread cult of Batuu only makes sense in the context of things like themes and authorial intent, and makes no difference or no concessions with regards to in-universe logic. So it's no wonder that people like the Night Sisters and hate the thread cult. Moving on.
All right. An innocent Instagram post about the acolyte from the show's star Amanda Sternberg quickly became a hotbed of vitriol as some fans celebrated the cancellation of the show and lambasted her as an actress and person. She isn't the first Star Wars actor to experience this. Kelly Marie Tran, who played Rose in Last Jedi, experienced so much online harassment that she ditched social media altogether.
What do you define as harassment? Do you define criticism as harassment as and when it's convenient? Do you define making jokes at someone's expense as harassment as and when it's convenient? This is the issue. You use a morally loaded buzzword like harassment, but you don't define your terms. And then when you present examples of alleged harassment, people notice that your definition of harassment is nowhere near the same as the average person's definition of harassment. On the internet, we know what cyber harassment looks like. We know of examples where people have been, for example, doxxed or driven to suicide. None of this happened to people like Kelly Marie Tran. What you're seeing there is informal criticism on the part of the audience towards the actor who was, written poorly in The Last Jedi and therefore made the IP worse. Do you understand how customers who are dissatisfied with the product or the work that the people they pay to do said work give them are perfectly entitled to being angry at them and to make that criticism known to the people in no uncertain terms? Because, you see, here's the thing. Critics get away with shitting all over things because they are critics, because it's in a formal structure. And yet the same behavior gets demonized by the powers that be because it exists in an informal structure as and when the audience does it. But given the fact that it's the audience who actually pays for the product, they have a much more invested reason to be critical of shoddy work than do critics, who very often get sent to things for free and or get privileged premature access to things. I.e., the people who are actually invested in Star Wars and who pay the salaries by proxy of the people engaged in it have a more justified reason for being critical than professional critics do. And yet it's the professional critics who get lionized by corporations and the audience who gets actively demonized even though they're the ones paying for the product. Does that seem like the right way around to you? Because not only does it not seem like the right way around to me, it seems like the exact inversion of what should be happening. Not to mention that the company shouldn't be allowed to demonize their audience as toxic fans in any case, because as the old saying goes, the audience is the customer is always right. And in fact, in the modern day, it very much seems like not only is it no longer true that the customer is always right, but that the customer themselves, for reason of being a customer, are for some reason seen as being actively immoral now. It's not just the customer is wrong, it's that the customer is actively immoral, according to a lot of the people who are tasked by these corporations to make use of these IPs. Moving on.
Alright, Granelli says the Acolyte serves as a warning to the rest of the Star Wars fanbase and Hollywood as a whole. The reason for the cancellation doesn't even matter at this point. In lieu of Disney explicitly stating why it canceled the Acolyte, the company has let the most toxic portion of its fan base take credit. I think that there's going to be more of a victory lap from that group of fans that believes they canceled it, and without a competing narrative, ostensibly they're going to be right, Granelli says.
They are right because the organic audience, the people you're referring to as toxic, avoided the Acolyte like the plague and or went out of their way to actively mock it. And given that the Acolyte's viewer numbers and ratings were shit, that does mean that the audience, the people you're defining as toxic, are right about their power over the people who are the stewards of the IP. Because if the audience doesn't like it enough to show up, all you've done by making a shitty product is lose money and prestige. And the more money and prestige you lose as a result of these creative decisions, the more you will eventually be incentivized to acquiesce to those creative decisions. Because whether you like it or not, you can't maintain an entire industry off of moral indignation. You do actually have to court the audience. And the more you decide to demonize the audience, the harder you're going to have to work to get the audience back on board eventually. Because whether you like it or not, the people you define as toxic are the ones who pay your bills and put food on your table. And the more you go out of your way to morally spite them, the less incentivized they are going to be to want to continue supporting you, which will result in them boycotting your product. And to borrow a phrase from Stephen King's The Stand, the unfortunate truth that you must come to grips with is the more you spite the fan base and the IP that the fan base is invested in, the less of a loss your failures will actually be. Because the art you attempt to create will in fact be so bad that the world will be better off when they bomb, whether you like it or not. And there will be no great loss as a result. If you want people to feel as though they would be losing something, try figuring out what your audience wants and then not demonizing them and then giving them what they want. The more you are willing to not only give your audience what they want, but understand why it's important that you give your audience what they want, the more successful you are liable to be. The more you flout this restriction, the more people will be gleeful when you fail because nothing of value will be lost. Moving on.
Commenting on Sternberg's Instagram post, one person said the power of real fans got this show canceled. Sick. Another comment, the power of many.
You see, this is the audience making the point to you that you can't morally indignate your way into silencing them. The things people want, they will continue to want regardless of social and moral consensus. And the more you refuse to give it to them and actively spite them while doing so, the more they are going to enjoy seeing you and your endeavors fail. And the more they're going to gloat when you do. Moving on.
Instead of cracking down on toxicity or issuing public statements of support for the creatives who are targets of harassment, it seems some Hollywood productions are logistically responding to the dangers of toxic fandom. Caitlin Dever, who will appear in the second season of HBO's acclaimed video game adaptation, The Last of Us, was given extra security on set because of the hateful response fans had to her character in the video game that serves as source material for the show.
You're not even addressing whether that was warranted or not. You're just saying it happened and therefore. Do you see how that in and of itself is a disconnect? Just because someone felt the need to hire more security does not mean that they were right to do so or that their fears were well founded. And this is the other issue. You can't just build your entire argument or your entire castle on the fact that people were afraid without ever asking whether they were justified to feel that way. Because that's the more important question. The issue is not they were afraid. The issue is, were they justified in feeling that sense of fear, or were they overreacting? The problem is, we can't ever even begin to ask that question because apparently to ask that question is to be quote unquote toxic. And I'm sorry, but until and unless I can ask the question as to whether your fears were justified, I'm going to operate on the assumption that your fears were not justified because you haven't actually proven whether they were or not. Just because someone is irrationally afraid of something does not mean their fear in and of itself is a justification for that reaction. The first question in relation to any emotion is what is causing that emotion, and is that emotion in any way justified? If you cannot bring yourself to ask that question, then the fact that people are afraid is completely meaningless to the discussion. Moving on.
Granelli worries about the message that sends not only to other fans, but creators who, like the Acolyte showrunner Leslie Headland, want to tell news stories in a franchise that resonates with so many people.
Okay, here's another very important question. Why, if you want to tell a different type of story than Star Wars, do you feel the need to tell it in the Star Wars universe? If you don't like or don't want the weight of the canon of Star Wars, you could make something original and hope that it would succeed by its own merits. The problem is, one of the operating procedures or axioms of social justice is that art is a means to an end, and that IPs become popular basically because of normative consensus. There's no regard for any pre-existing qualities of that IP in this line of thinking. And so they assume that since people are attracted to these IPs arbitrarily, that they can change everything substantive about that IP and the fan base will still show up. The problem is, that is fundamentally untrue. People become fans of IPs because of the qualities of those IPs, because of the characteristics of those IPs. So if you change a pre-existing IP to suit your own form of storytelling, people who were drawn to the inherent qualities of that IP will be annoyed at you. The other option would be to try to build your own IP from the ground up. The reason you don't do that is because you think that all fan bases are arbitrary. And so In order to have a quote-unquote impact on the world, you must make use of pre-established IPs. And let's be honest here, the main reason why you fail whenever you do occasionally try to make your own shit is because the idea that you thought was so sacrosanct, that you were so egotistically sure was gold, was in fact worthless because it was a bad idea to begin with, and or a bad execution of an idea that previously would have had potential if it were treated in the metrics of meritocracy. This is the main issue with all this art school hackery, okay? If you fundamentally do not believe that art is valuable for its own sake, or that meritocracy is a thing that exists, or that norms and preconceptions are there for some kind of meritocratic reason, you will therefore go out of your way to subvert these things. And by subverting them, by subverting everything that makes something good, you will in fact make something bad, which will make people not willing to hear you out with regards to your original ideas. So, in other words, co-opt a pre-established IP and contradict it, and you will fail because it is the qualities of that IP that draw people to it. Or make something shit because of your own artistic lens of how quality works, and it will fail on the grounds that you think that meritocracy doesn't exist, and therefore will go out of your way not to provide any merits to your own original ideas. The only option, the only middle path here is to either use pre-existing IPs on their own terms, or to make something new that has meritocracy about it, i.e., something that has recommendable or engaging or interesting qualities. Because people who believe in the idea of quality and meritocracy have very little problem in creating things that draw people's attention. The only people that do are people who try to co-opt pre-existing IPs and change everything about them, or the people who, by virtue of art school hackery, don't believe that people are drawn to stories based on merits. They believe it's all some kind of socio-cultural normative consensus. And the more they operate under that premise, by the way, is wrong, and by virtue of it being wrong, they will ruin everything they touch. Art doesn't draw people because of normative consensus. Art draws people because systems of quality and merit, or ideas and mechanisms that entail quality and merit, actually do meaningfully exist, whether you like it or not. Moving on.
If you're a young, talented screenwriter or filmmaker who grew up a huge Star Wars and now you have an original idea that takes place in that world, are you going to want to go to Disney? Brunelli says, does that mean we're going to get boring storytelling?
See, the thing is, the aspiring writers who actually are Star Wars fans have no problem operating within the mechanics of Star Wars because they appreciate the mechanics of Star Wars that already exist. The only people who have a problem adapting themselves to Star Wars are people who actively resent it for some reason. And that's the thing. So many of these failed co-optings of IPs, the creative in question who tried to subvert the IP go out of their way to explain that they didn't like or didn't want to operate in the IP as it was written. And so they went out of their way to change a bunch of shit. And yet, for some reason, it doesn't click in their heads that maybe we should leave positions of writing Star Wars open to people who actually appreciate Star Wars and have no problem adapting it as written. because people who actually care about pre-existing IPs have no problem coming up with ideas that would be good for those pre-existing IPs because they themselves like and understand those pre-existing IPs. The only people that do have a problem are people who think there is something fundamentally flawed about the pre-existing IP and therefore need to go out of their way to change or subvert it. Those people will never be successful. People who will be successful are the people who actually care about Star Wars, actually know about Star Wars, and actually can come up with consistent and edifying ways to use the pre-existing canon of Star Wars. Moving on.
It's not a death knell for Star Wars by any means, but Grinelli worries Disney's treatment of the Acolyte could have a cooling effect on what kinds of stories are told in the Star Wars universe and, given Disney's outsized role in Hollywood, franchise storytelling in general. Stories are going to continue, but there are going to be fewer chances taken with those stories, and that's sad. Okay, I don't even think. Again, I refuse to watch The Acolyte, but I don't think there were really risks taken.
My phone fucking glitched. I don't know what happened.
Okay. Okay, so what I was saying was I refuse to watch. I refuse to watch The Acolyte before I understand there were no risks taken.
Yeah, no. The only risk was, hey, let's subvert everything about the Star Wars universe and instead turn it into essentially our own overglorified fan fiction. And as I just got done alluding to, that kind of approach to pre-existing IPs usually isn't going to work because you're operating on the assumption that there's no quality or no there's nothing about that IP that draws people to it organically. You're essentially making the argument that there's no meat on the bone of Star Wars or any pre-existing IP to make new stories out of. And that's always going to be wrong because I can guarantee you that someone who actually does know and understand things about pre-existing IPs could come up with things that make sense within the in-universe logic of the IP, but would also be new and interesting stories within that IP. It's the people that, for some reason, don't understand why other people like things that have a problem attaining that level of likability.
Okay, so not to toot my own horn, obviously, and I've discussed this before on stream like a few times when we talked about The Acolyte recently. But I have started again to rewrite the sequel trilogy because I had ideas for it like in the past, but I never really like truly fleshed them out.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about other ideas to expand, but I would honestly say, and I've read a few fan fictions because I read fan fictions, good ones, mind you. I find a lot more good ones than bad ones. But or fan projects or whatever. But it does seem like a lot of fans of Star Wars know how it goes. Again, it's just like I guess the issue is like more so paying respect to what has come before while also trying to God damn it, I'm losing my train of thought here. It'll come back to me. Continue.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But in short, Hollywood, if you want to be successful with adapting pre-existing IPs, try finding someone who likes the pre-existing IP and stop putting people in charge who hate and distrust and dislike the pre-existing IP. For example, Rian Johnson never should have had a job writing a Star Wars movie because he went out of his way to say he didn't like Star Wars and wanted to tell an anti-Star Wars movie. Or people like the creatives behind She-Hulk, the show, shouldn't have been put in charge of She-Hulk because they didn't have any basis for the character and they didn't try to adapt her personality as it was in the original source material. And this and by the way, the same is true for just about every. Granted, sometimes you can get a non-accurate rendition of a pre-existing IP that can have merit in its own right. For example, V for Vendetta, the movie, was very, very dissimilar from its original source material, but it has merit on its own. It has merit of its own to stand up on, which honestly often make people argue that the movie was an improvement on the source material. And Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy movies are another example of probably wasn't the purest adaptation of the original source material, but had enough understanding and affinity towards the base concept of the original source material that it was able to find a way to reflavor things. But even so, people who have more knowledge about a given IP and more connection to said IP are more able to understand where things can be in flux and where things must stay the same. Because I guarantee you almost no Hellboy fans were insulted by Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy. And very few fans of V for Vendetta's graphic novel were insulted by V for Vendetta the movie. But the people who knew enough about those IPs were able to make the decision as to what is acceptable to not adapt and what must be adapted in order to maintain the spirit of the work, and or maybe even improve on the spirit of the work, which is possible. You can deviate from a pre-existing IP in such a way that it improves pre-existing IP. Like, for example, even the author of the book Who Framed Roger Rabbit was smitten enough with the idea of the movie that he actually retconned his own work when he penned a sequel to Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And that required, but the thing is, that requires that way of deviating from the source material in a way that actually improves on it rather than lessening it. That at the very least requires the notion of meritocracy, because people who go out of their way to shit all over meritocracy, or who spite the idea of meritocracy, or who believe that meritocracy is some kind of delusion, surprising no one, are rather shit at understanding what would be meritocratic. You have to have some notion of quality or some notion of merit before you can find untapped or untested merit in something that already exists. And even then, it's better to, as much as possible, mesh the original source material with your new take on it so as to create something new that actually adds something to the IP. Again, vis-a-vis the V for Vendetta movies or Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy, both of which not only captured the spirit of the original source material in all the ways that mattered, but in some ways were able to streamline or make better things that were only loosely connected to the original source material, which is why many, many people are shocked and stunned when they read the V for Vendetta comic and realize that in the comics, V was an anarcho-communist, Whereas in the movies, he's more of a classical liberal. So much so that he even quotes Voltaire. Anyway, moving forward.
Yeah. So this is from Hajaba.com. The Acolyte getting canceled is another win for toxic fans. It's written by Mike Redman, published October 20th, 2024.
The fans you define as toxic are the ones who believe that the value of the IP is contained in the IP and not in non-diegetic sociopolitical or thematic bullshit. What you're defining as toxicity there is what other people refer to as this thing called sincerity. Because it's not the insincere fans who prioritize the in-universe logic or the world building or the characters over themes. It's the instrumentalist art school hacks who treat all art like a sociopolitical or moral or thematic means to an end with almost no value in the in-universe logic or world building or characterization. And that attitude of art only exists as a means to a sociopolitical, moral, or thematic end, is exactly what makes something shit. In order to make something that's actually worthwhile, you have to consider it as valuable for its own sake on some level. It doesn't have to necessarily be a conscious thought, but it definitely has to be something that you would prioritize over yourself or your own ego. And that is why so many authors, or so many artists, or so many writers have such a hard time creating meaningfully good stuff because they don't have the capacity to say to themselves, I, as the author, or I, as the writer, or I, as the artist, am less important than the idea which I serve. And if you have no capacity to prioritize the value of the piece itself over your own ego, you will never create something with lasting creative potential. Never. Moving on.
Stop me if you heard this one before. Star Wars delivered a bold entry that asked tough questions about the franchise.
You mean it shit all over the franchise and went out of its way to subvert everything about the franchise because the people who made it actively dislike the IP?
Only for toxic fans to freak the hell out, make a lot of noise, and get what they think they want. We watched it happen with The Last Jedi, leading to the Miliquitous turd known as the Rise of Skywalker, and now history is repeating itself with the Acolyte.
Again, the people you're referring to as toxic are the people who have a sincere enough love of the IP that they prioritize the in-universe logic, characterization, or world building of that IP over their socio-political, moro-egotistical, or thematic whims. I wouldn't define those people as toxic. I would, in fact, define the people who see everything under the sun as a socio-political, egotistical, or authorial means to an end as toxic, because they literally cannot see the self-sustaining or self-contained value of anything for its own sake. That, to me, is far more toxic than someone who prioritizes the love of an IP over their own ego. Moving on.
Okay.
Yeah.
On Monday night, Lucasfilm officially confirmed that Season 2 is dead in the water, making The Acolyte the first Star Wars and Marvel series to get canceled on Disney+. Without getting too in the weeds here, Marvel had a backdoor to avoiding these announcements by billing its shows as miniseries, but The Acolyte was clearly supposed to have a multi-season arc. The decision not to renew it makes it the first major cancellation of a powerhouse property on Disney Plus, and a harbinger of the belt tightening to come. But at least no one is speaking on background and already blaming Amanda Sternberg for clapping back at racists. You know where this is going, right?
This is the point at which I'm gonna say something which is non-material to the issue at hand, but makes me feel Schadenfreude anyway. Gee, it's almost like if you have a broader and longer form story to tell, you maybe should have an episode count that's more than 8 episodes. Again, this is just my back in my day gloating about episode count, because back in my day, every show got between 13 and 22 episodes. And that made it more possible to tell longer form stories. And it would probably help the cohesiveness of certain stories if they had more episodes to play with. Now, mind you, I don't think that would have helped The Acolyte, because there doesn't appear to have been much in the way of merit to that idea to begin with, or at least whatever interesting ideas The Acolyte did have were completely and utterly balked by a failure of execution. But at the very least, it would allow them to reach a satisfying endpoint if they went back to the erstwhile status quo that I grew up with, where the average episode count for a show was between 13 and 24 episodes or so. It would at least allow stories to be wrapped up rather than leaving literally every show on a cliffhanger. As much as I love Hazbin Hotel, they were guilty of the same shit. Um, Although, in the defense of Hazbin Hotel and Vivian Madrano in particular, she originally wanted about a 16 episode run for the first season, and Amazon and A24 were unwilling to risk um, a new IP on that episode count, so they gave her half the episode she wanted, which I find to be slightly annoying, because I'm betting that me and Vivian Madrano are around the same age and therefore can remember times where it wasn't unusual for a show to have 13 episodes minimum and usually about double that. Anyway, like I said, this is a complete sidebar of me gloating about back in my day when shows actually were allowed to end their arcs before the season finale. But yeah, aside from just gloating about maybe stop making 8 episode miniseries out of fucking everything, but yeah, not material to the point. So just moving on.
Hopefully, sorry. Hopefully, whoever slung that shit is already out the door, because there was no reason to muddy the water with that nonsense. Why even do that? As you saw with my recaps, I unabashedly love The Acolyte. It was a breath of fresh air after watching the Mandoverse turn into a bland vehicle for porting cartoon characters into live action with extremely middling results.
Okay, I will agree with you there that Ahsoka was a complete shell of what the character was in the animated universe. But I must ask this question, and I mean this in all sincerity. What on earth did you like about the Acolyte? What? Because this is the problem with the Acolyte. There are very few non-ideological reasons to recommend it, and so I must conclude, in absence of any other examples of what you liked about it, that you only liked the Acolyte for ideological art house brat based reasons. I could be wrong, but I literally cannot think of any qualities to recommend the Acolyte that aren't purely art house theory driven or based on ideology. Moving on.
Uh, That said, I freebase entertainment news 24/7, so I know the numbers for the Acolyte were not there when the ratings didn't see an episode 5 bounce, which was a delicious piece of Star Wars that I will forever cherish watching with my son as it melted our faces off. That was the ball game.
Episode 5 of The Acolyte was nowhere near as impressive as everyone seems to want to think it is. A lot of the choreography didn't even connect to anything. Like there were people in the battle scenes of episode 5 of The Acolyte waving their lightsabers around at nothing. I.e., they had no reason to wave their lightsabers at whatever they were waving them at, because the main combatant that they were combating against was literally not within arm's reach of them at the time. So I don't understand where people are getting this whole thing of episode 5 choreography or something was so great, because again, a actually well choreographed action scene requires everyone involved in the action scene to have their movements be explicable. And there were literally characters in the background of the episode 5 fight scene who were waving their lightsabers around for no reason and to no avail. Moving on.
Unfortunately, we've hit the art as commerce section of our tale. I'm not beholden to shareholders or however business work. So it's easy for me to say, "Hey, Disney, another $180 million, please." That's a hard sale to make, even with the numbers to back it up. As we speak, there is a bloodletting across the industry as studios pull back on spending after flushing money down the streaming drain. That's especially true with Disney, which came very close to milking Marvel to death by releasing too many shows. Well, no, I'd say it's releasing crap, but
Yeah,
okay.
it wasn't about the amount of shows, it was about those shows being largely shit. There was literally one episode of WandaVision that was any good. That was episode 8, the episode that focused heavily on Agatha, which is why even while being very much an anti-SJW and everything, am still looking forward to Agatha all along, because she is the one aspect of WandaVision that I wanted to see a continuation on, because she was probably the most interesting character released in Phase 4 altogether, with the possible exception of Elsa Bloodstone and Jack Russell in the Werewolf by Night special. But yeah, Agatha was the only worthwhile part of WandaVision, and so it made perfect sense for her to get her own show. But shows like She-Hulk and Falcon and the Winter Soldier were absolute dog shit, regardless of how much money they cost. And so it's not about the amount of shows, it's the subject matter those shows were about and how those ideas were conveyed to the audience. Because you could, in theory, have made some of those ideas work with better execution, more well-rounded characters, and better regards for world building. But because you didn't focus on likable characters, interesting worlds, consistent in-universe logic, or engaging world building, the shows were shit, and people didn't watch them. For the most part. Moving on.
Uh, that's especially true with Disney, which came the studios pivoting back to theatrical releases, which we've already seen with The Mandalorian and Grogu. I could talk forever about that decision, but we're losing the thread here. There is, however, an argument to be made that Disney could strengthen Star Wars by continuing the Acolyte story and giving it a longer runway to bring in new fans. The show offered a complex look at the Motherfucker. Jedi already got a complex look both in the prequel trilogy and Star Wars: The Clone Wars.
Not to mention all of the decanonized EU stuff. that
Okay.
that Disney very easily could have just adapted and basically used as an excuse to print money, but instead chose to go with their own original canon while simultaneously not having any idea of what ideas they wanted to explore with said canon or how to explore it.
So, how to say this? I'm fine with people doing new canon. Obviously, if it's interesting and engaging, which, let's be
Yeah.
honest,
If you're going to try to replace canon that people already liked with new canon, it had better be at least equivalent in quality to the old canon, if not better. I would lean more in the direction of it has to be better in order to justify replacing things people already liked. But I would accept things that were at least equally as good. But this doesn't matter because Disney did neither. They neither created anything that was equivalent in quality to the pre-existing canon or better. Everything they did was varying degrees of incompetent to just straight up bad. And therein lies the problem. It doesn't matter how many well-intentioned good ideas you think you have if you can't actually convey them in a way that the audience can get on board with. And doubling down on the Acolyte may give it an opportunity to get better, or it may just continue to get worse. Because the main issue with the Acolyte wasn't even its low viewer numbers, it was the reception that was coupled with those lower viewer numbers. I.e., not only did very few people even watch The Acolyte, but those that did not like what they saw for the most part. In fact, quite a lot of people actually consider the famous Star Wars holiday special better than most of The Acolyte. And there's at least a good argument as to why. Because so much of the ideas that the Acolyte could have made use of were not made good use of. They were, in fact, some of the worst possible renditions of those ideas as possible. And aside from the ideas that underpinned the Acolyte, the effects were shit, the sets looked cheap, the character designs were minimalistic as shit, and the story beats made no logical sense and had no reasonable through line. Not to mention the straight up canon problems with, for example, having Ki-Adi-Mundi in the scenes of the Jedi Temple, even though he shouldn't have been born yet, or the fact that if um if this if May's master considered himself a Sith, then Darth Plagueis or his master Darth Tenebris should have showed up and immediately killed him for being a rival, as we saw Palpatine do the moment that Savage Opress and Maul leveled up to the level of being rivals on Mandalore in the Clone Wars.
Giant Turtle, it doesn't need to be better or even equal. Just don't bury the lead. Label it an AU if you're changing canon, or at least a retcon if small, and make a new IP if you change too much.
I disagree with you, Dragon Turtle. That is my hard and fast rule with regards to retcons. It has to either be equivalent to the thing that was lost or better, preferably better, because then it makes the losing of the pre-existing canon worth it if it's better. But at the very least, if something is equally as good as the thing it's replacing, then there's nothing particularly lost so much as there is just a new piece slotted into the hole of an old piece. But as a general rule, my rule is if you want to change something, you have to make something equivalent to the thing you're replacing or better. There better be an actual reason why you're altering it, or you don't get to alter it. In my hierarchy of things, anyway.
Okay. I agree for retcons. It has to be greater than. I'm assuming that I can never tell the difference with those symbols. I always have trouble with that. I'm assuming that's greater than or equal to the old. But if you're making massive changes, just making it a U, if not a brand new IP. Don't call it the original.
See, again, my rule remains consistent whether it's massive changes or not. Like, if you change something, you had best have a good reason to change it. And one of the only things I will accept there is we had an idea that is greater than or equal to the thing we would be replacing.
And before this spirals into a full-on discussion, because I know it is, because you guys.
Yeah. Moving forward. Yeah.
I think we can all agree that Star Wars has not done anything greater or equal to like the Legends continuity.
It's so downward spiral that even people who hated the prequels are looking at the prequels nostalgically now, which is probably the one good, like the one saving grace of the Disney downward spiral, is it made a bunch of people who were autistically hypercritical of the prequels admit what people like me who grew up with the prequels were always saying, which is the prequels, however clunky in execution, had merits that were worthwhile and worth preserving, particularly Revenge of the Sith. Which I myself have a theory that in every Star Wars trilogy or era of Star Wars, there's usually only ever one good movie. In the case of the original trilogy, the good movie is Empire. In the case of the prequels, it's Revenge of the Sith, and in the case of the sequels, the one good movie that they were responsible for wasn't even a main episode part. It was Rogue One.
Again, Drandrell, if you want to discuss with Dalton like later on Discord or something, please do it. So there, it's just this is a long article, and we got another. Well, we might have to skip the other article we had after this and just go to the trailer thing, just for time purposes.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Moving forward, and if we do end up,
you're good. You're good.
If we do end up skipping the other thing, we'll save it for next week.
Yeah.
But anyway, moving right along here.
Where was it? Okay. And despite being set 100 years before the prequel trilogy, it laid some neat groundwork into how the Space Wizards went from gilded protectors to Palpatine building the Empire right in front of their stupid faces.
It's not as though we didn't have, even in Disney's retcon canon, it's not as though we don't have a good idea of what the centuries prior to the prequel era are like. And therein lies a large part of the problem. For example, Ki-Adi-Mundi should not have been born yet in the Acolytes timeline. And once again, and I point this out because it is the one thing that I kept expecting to happen in the Acolyte that did not happen, which is if I don't even remember the kid's name, if the master of May, if the teacher of May and the ex-apprentice of Green Jedi lady, whose name I don't remember either, if he rose to the level of being a Sith Master, whoever was the reigning Sith Master at the time should have sensed him and taken out a rival in exactly the same way that Palpatine did when Maul and Savage leveled up to the level of being considered rivals. Which, by the way, I loved the way they played that in Clone Wars. How he basically ignored them entirely until he sent them level up enough to be considered rivals. Because it didn't matter to him whether Maul was still alive as long as he didn't rise to the level of mastery. And the moment he did was the moment that Palpatine excused himself and went and re-straightened out the rule of two. Which, by the way, the rule of two never even gets a mention in the Acolyte, which is odd considering that we're supposed to, according to the show, consider Maze Master to be a Sith, when in actuality I think he's probably just a Dark Jedi. And in the event that we're supposed to consider him a Sith, and in the event that he has the power to force push an entire group of Jedi Masters, that means that Darth Plagueis or Darth Tenebris, probably Darth Tenebris, because again, 100 years prior to the prequels, so Plagueis would still be in apprenticeship to Tenebris at that point, I believe. It probably should have been Darth Tenebris who showed up and then eliminated a rival as per the rule of two, because in the era of the prequels and before, for 1,000 years before, the Sith were very, very heavily indoctrinated into the rule of two by Darth Bane and his edicts. Moving on.
More importantly, the Acolyte gave us Manny Jacinto's The Stranger, who is easily the most compelling character this franchise has ever seen. Oh, fuck off. Okay, that is clearly evident of this motherfucker not knowing shit about Star Wars.
Do we even need to bring up the list of all of the characters that are more compelling than... One of the reasons I don't remember his name is because I kept referring to him as Darth Ezra Miller the whole time. But yeah, I believe that's who she's referring to here. And
she.
Hmm?
It's not a she. It's a guy. Mike Redman.
Okay, then you especially have no reason to like the Acolyte, because it was supposedly female pandering. It didn't succeed at being female pandering, of course, because instead of focusing on female characters, it focused on ideologically feminist characters, and no, those aren't the same thing. But yeah, Darth Ezra Miller is nowhere near the top 1,000 likable, interesting, engaging, or compelling characters in the Star Wars universe. Whether you're talking about Disney's canon or the old canon or some combination of the two, or like just the movies, or like no matter which way you slice it, almost all characters that exist in the Star Wars universe are more compelling than Darth Ezra Miller, whose name I probably will never learn.
He's just called The Stranger. Or Manny Jacinto, if you want to call him by the actor.
Well, yeah, that's what the author of this article calls him, but I'm pretty sure he actually has a name. I just don't remember it. Which, by the way, if you love the Acolyte so much, shouldn't you have used his actual name? Because I'm pretty sure it does get mentioned several times. It's just I can't be arsed to think of it, because every time he was on screen, I referred to him as Darth Ezra Miller. Moving on.
Most importantly, the Acolyte gave us mentions. Not only that, but he was stacked up against Lee Jun-jae's tortured soul. I hope to God people continue to discover this gem of the story, because the performances were incredible to watch.
Yeah, I agree with you at least on Lee Jung-jae. The man learned English just to play this role as Master Soul, if anyone's curious. And he was literally the only reason to watch The Acolyte in retrospect. He acted the shit out of what he was given, even though what he was given was about the thickness of a piece of wet toilet paper. Moving on.
Alright. I mentioned watching The Acolyte with my son, and he went to the show not expecting much. He was immediately captivated by Soul, and the stranger lit his face on fire with awesome. It's the most excited he's been about Star Wars in a long time, so he was absolutely crushed by the cancellation news. Leslie Headland brought a much-needed jolt of electricity and intrigue to a galaxy far, far away, and she should be very proud.
Unfortunately, no. And again, from the interview we saw of her, it seems like a lot of the problems with the Acolyte were more brought about by Kathleen Kennedy's meddling than Leslie Headland's work. I actually really wish that Leslie Headland had gone with her original set of instincts and done something that actually would be interesting to a actual Star Wars fan, rather than reflavoring her previous play about twins and being forced to do that by Kathleen's editorial mandate. As usual, Darth Kanateus the Incompetent continues to make everything worse. Moving on, though.
Alright, last paragraph. So what happens next? Best case scenario, the story and or characters continue in the novels. It would be salt in the wound if Lucasfilm completely erased the Acolyte from canon. No, it won't. But at this point, who the hell knows? In the meantime, Star Wars is seemingly content with course correcting back to inert action figure showcases and trying to squeeze more money off its merchandising golden goose, who's about to be half a decade old.
See, that last line, that contempt, that tells me you should not be trusted with regards to your opinions on Star Wars. No one who actually gave a damn about Star Wars would refer to it that way. Not even during the prequel era was any Star Wars fan ever that cynical about their preferred IP. And that's again the thing. We need to stop putting these IPs in the hands of people who have active contempt for the fans of said IPs and for the IPs themselves. Especially IPs as big and pervasive as Star Wars, because I am sure there are hundreds of thousands of potential writers who would give their left bollock to write for Star Wars. And yet they are not the ones who get hired. It's the art school hacks and the ideologues that get hired instead. And that is dead center the heart of the problem. The fact that not only are they hiring people who have active contempt, not just for the fans, but for the IP itself, but that they're allowed to display this subversive contempt for all the world to see, rather than it being expected to do their job as stewards of the IP and do right by the IP accordingly. That is very much the heart of the problem. Moving on.
Right. It's about a half decade old, but the little green guy isn't a yucky girl, so he gets a movie even though the numbers for the wet fart known as The Mandalorian Season 3 took a nosedive. More like Nepo Baby Yoda, am I right? Okay, this guy's a fucking asshole.
Again, the sheer disgusting, spiteful, bitter, malignant contempt. It flabbergasts me. So many people have been brought so much joy by so many of these IPs for decades and decades and decades. And yet it's people like this that get the jobs for the journalist profession or for the writing staff itself. The just sheer black whole of disgusting nihilism and neo-Hegelian ideologue bullshit just flummoxes me. And these people think they're the like arbiters of superior intellect and morality. They can't they can't bring themselves to feel moved by a piece of art or feel moved or be like inspired by a piece of art unironically and on its own terms, but they think they're the moral superiors of everyone who's ever been moved and molded and inspired by these things.
All right, Giant Troll.
Mhm. Yeah, it's just so. Do you want to skip the next one, or do you want to go through it?
I think we can wait until next week. To be fair,
Okay.
it's given the first three first three articles were all semi-connected. Uh, I think it's
Mhm.
just easier for us if we just
Yep.
I
We'll
want,
we'll 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 save the Fallout article for next week.
yeah. So you know what? I need to watch the Fallout series. I've heard a lot of good things about it.
It's semi decent up until like the last episode, and everything kind of falls flat. And it seems to be operating under the assumption of the worst possible game in-game timeline being canon. But stylistically and everything, it's at least on point.
All right. Well, everyone see that?
Yes.
All right. So this is a teaser trailer for a anthology series coming to Prime Video called Secret Level. I had seen this come out a couple days ago, and I just remembered it today while I was setting up uh, the stream. So I thought we could watch it. Teaser trailer is only like a minute 40 long, so
Mm-hmm.
so it's supposed to be an anthology series set with for video games. A lot of people who have worked on, if anyone knows the series on Netflix, Love, Death, and Robots, which is like an animated anthology series that is really cool.
Yeah.
Uh, a lot of people from that are working on this.
That's a good sign, certainly.
Yeah. Um, I do want to kind of wait for Giant Turtle catch up a bit,
Mm-hmm.
but so I'm not gonna lie, I got somewhat inspired as we were reading through the Acolyte articles, uh, trying to write out some notes for my Star Wars rewrite.
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just trying to focus on writing an opening crawl for the first movie. It's weird how often when we cover something, I get inspired to do some things.
Yes. He literally cannot help it, folks.
To be fair, it just kind of happens naturally.
I swear you're gonna end up like Richard Maddock after Dream gets upset with him one of these days.
I haven't done anything to piss off the god of dreams or so.
This is true.
And to be fair, relatively lately, I haven't had as many ideas because I've been busy with work and life. So.
Anyway, shall we, Banana?
Well, it's video games, so I'm thinking either Doritos or Mountain Dew.
I was going to think of some power up that people eat in video games.
Can you think of anything?
I know there's some like food that video game characters eat that's supposed to like, be like a power up. I just can't think of anything.
Mushrooms.
Yeah, why not? Mushrooms.
Alright. I'm just gonna assume you're all caught up then, Dragon Turtle, because yeah.
Yep.
All right, mushrooms it is then.
Mushrooms.
It's time. This world has waited for your arrival.
Well, visually it looks interesting. I'm in Space Marines from Warhammer.
Or are they supposed to be the Spartans from?
No, they're Space Marines.
Well, I mean,
I know the difference.
apparently Prime does have some kind of deal with Games Workshop now, so I'm not entirely surprised to see them here. Just don't inflame the female Space Marine question, please. Prime, please. Don't do it.
And there was also a look of Sifu. If those who don't know what that is, it was a action kung fu game that was released a few years ago. I don't think it's supposed to be a Ready Player One thing. Like I said, it's just like a anthology series based around gaming IPs.
I'm sort of surprised they're actually using stuff from the gaming IPs. I thought they were gonna like make parody versions or XPs of gaming stuff, kind of like Wreck-It Ralph did. I wonder how I
Wait.
wonder how much all the licensing cost them.
Wait, didn't Wreck-It Ralph have like actual characters from actual games?
Yeah, but its main characters were from a fictionalized one. Is what I meant. Like
Okay.
I wasn't expecting them to make references to actual existing games. I thought they were gonna kind of do what Free Guy did and make up their own gaming like equivalents to stuff.
I mean, yeah,
I
from
wonder. Yeah, I wonder how much the licensing cost them for this.
but yeah, from Love, Death, and Robot creators, visually, I'm not surprised how well it looks.
Yeah, because Love, Death, and Robots was good at not only using was good at not only its own aesthetic but also really good at like varying the aesthetics.
Yeah, it was very
in video
like I think I can legitimately use this word experimental in terms of
Yeah.
animation and style.
in the
And
way that that's supposed to mean, and not just an excuse to be art house and pretentious.
no. Yeah, like I said, I think I had seen a look of like Sifu, which was like I said, a video game that came out like a couple years back, centered around. Well, it was basically like a kung fu movie made into a video game.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually really good from what I remember. Like the whole crux of it, you can die and come back, but your character gets older the more you die.
Oh shit!
Yeah, like it has like the character has like this medallion who that resurrects them, but like I said, it ages them faster.
Interesting.
Um, I think it gets harder the older you get, obviously. So,
Well, yeah.
and story wise, it's basically like a tale of revenge that evolves into something else. So,
Anyway, mushrooms.
there we go. Mushrooms.
It is you. You will open the door. Because you are the chosen. All those moments.
Again, visually, I'm just impressed.
Well, yeah. I'm not surprised though, because it is also very reminiscent of the style of Love, Death, and Robots.
Yeah, so it makes me wonder. Wait, did Love, Death, and Robots get canceled or something? Because if they're doing this,
I don't think so. I think it's just taking forever for them to make the next season. Then again, Netflix seems to have a everything gets 4 seasons, but no more than 4 seasons rule.
Dragon Prince. That's an exception, I'd say.
Yeah, like Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, I think got 5. Castlevania original run got 4. Although it may have run longer if Garth Ennis didn't, or Warren Ellis. I always get them mixed up. If Warren Ellis didn't get me too'd.
Mhm.
So yeah, it seems like everything Netflix does, if it's successful enough, gets 4 or 5 seasons, but no more than that. Which on the one hand I can understand, and on the other hand, it really nerfs a lot of good shows when you cut them off that quickly.
Mm-hmm. Mushrooms.
Mushrooms.
It's a new adventure. Just for you.
I do like the sense of wonder and awe, which, I mean, given video games, that was kind of the whole point of them.
I mean, yeah, it is very wholesome, which is interesting. I guess that beats the hell out of referencing things like Gamergate and having to take a stance on quote unquote toxic gamer culture. So I guess good for them for maintaining some kind of neutrality and wholesomeness rather than political spite.
Mushroom?
Mushrooms.
Come in. You have a game to play.
Oh, son of a bitch. Wait.
What? What happened?
Press the wrong button. Skip to
Oh.
another video.
Oh.
One sec. Alright. I also noticed that it gave a list of games that they're using as inspiration for these stories.
Which again, I guess they have to do because I imagine the
Warhammer.
licensing was pretty expensive.
Okay, hold on. Hold on. A New World Eternum. I saw Warhammer. Outer Worlds 2.
I mean, like I say, it does make sense they'd use Warhammer considering that they technically have a deal with Games Workshop already, so it would be kind of wasteful if they didn't use it.
Pac-Man, Mega Man. Armored Core. Sifu. So it actually is kind of impressive that they got all these IPs, like the rights to make these.
Mm.
All right, shall we mushroom?
Mushrooms.
To play.
It looks interesting.
Yeah.
Glad to see that the guys who did Love, Death, and Robots are still getting work. I still think they didn't cancel it because I think I would have heard if they had canceled it. Because there's only been 2 seasons of Love, Death, and Robots, I think.
3.
3. So even by like normal Netflix standards, it should have at least room for 1 or 2 more seasons in it. But then again, I guess if the creatives can manage to work on that and this simultaneously, then all the more power to them.
Yeah, it's got 3 seasons.
But anyway, outros.
Yeah. So with that, folks, I want to say goodbye. Adios. Aloha. Avideze. Sayonara. Peace. Cheers. And
Shalom and fuck off.